The mud at Althorp in November swallows Wellington boots to the ankle, and nobody who has ever stood in a ploughed field in Northamptonshire in late autumn would call it romantic. It was cold, it smelled of wet dog and gun oil. Beaters were shouting somewhere beyond the hedge line, and pheasants kept breaking cover in that clumsy, panicked way that makes even seasoned guns flinch. Prince Charles was there as a guest of the family, invited up from London by Sarah Spencer, the eldest daughter of the house, a woman he had been quietly, semi-publicly, and not at all secretly, courting for the better part of a year. He was 29 years old. He had a title that made him the most watched bachelor on earth, and a private life that had somehow, against considerable odds, stayed almost entirely his own. Sarah brought a little sister along. This was not unusual. The Spencers were a large, loud, horse-mad family, and their teenage daughter had a habit of turning up wherever anything interesting was happening on the estate. She was 16. She had left school without much academic distinction and no particular plan, and she spent her days at Althorp doing what a 16-year-old with a big house and a pony does, which is to say not very much of consequence to anyone outside the family. Charles would later describe her, in an interview he gave once, the story of his life required him to account for it, as a very jolly and amusing 16-year-old, full of fun. That is the whole of what he thought of her that day, by his own account. A jolly girl, full of fun. Nothing more was recorded, because nothing more happened. He came for the shooting and for Sarah. The younger sister was scenery. What almost nobody watching that field in 1977 understood, and what almost every documentary made since has gotten backwards, is whose story that afternoon actually belonged to. It did not belong to the 16-year-old in the Wellingtons, not yet, not for 3 more years. It belonged to the 22-year-old standing near the Land Rovers, the one who had already spent the better part of a year finding out exactly what it cost to be the woman a future king was seen with in public. Sarah Spencer had watched Charles across a shooting lunch, across a dance floor, across a ski slope in the Swiss Alps, and across the pages of every tabloid in Britain, for longer than her sister had been old enough to understand what any of it meant. She had already told a reporter, in words that would be quoted at her for the rest of her life, that she was not in love with him, and would not marry a man she did not love, whether he was a duke or, in the version everyone remembers, a dustman. She had already decided, in other words, exactly what she thought of the position her little sister would eventually inherit. She just never got the chance to warn her, or perhaps she did, and it changed nothing, because some things you cannot actually warn a person about. You can only watch them find out. This is not a story about Princess Diana. It barely touches her, and when it does, it is only ever from the doorway, because that is where she stood while all of this happened. This is a story about the sister who got there first. The one who was photographed on the slopes at Klosters, looking like she belonged in the position everyone assumed she was about to fill. The one who sat across from Charles at family lunches at Sandringham and Windsor, while newspapers ran headlines asking whether Britain finally had its future queen. The one who, by every outward measure available to Fleet Street in 1977, was the frontrunner, the favourite, the answer to a question the entire country was impatient to have settled, and the one who looked at the life on offer, at the man attached to it, and did something almost nobody in her position had done before her. She said no, not loudly, not with a scandal. She simply refused to become what the machinery around Charles needed her to become, and then she stepped back far enough to watch someone else walk into the space she had vacated. To understand why she did that, and what she actually saw in the year and a half she spent closer to Prince Charles than almost any woman before Camilla Parker Bowles, you have to go back further than that muddy field. You have to go back to a house that had been feeding daughters into the royal family's orbit for 3 generations, a father who had literally worked for the king, and a set of family wounds that had nothing to do with princes at all, and that shaped Sarah Spencer long before Buckingham Palace ever noticed she existed. The Spencer name did not arrive at the royal family's doorstep in the 1970s. It had been circling that world for the better part of 300 years by the time Sarah was born, and the family's fortune, like most Old English fortunes, was built on something considerably less romantic than royal favour. The first Spencers to rise to real prominence made their money as sheep farmers and wool traders in the 1500s, a fact the family itself has never been particularly shy about, since it meant that by the time other aristocratic families were still living off inherited land and inherited debt, The Spencers already had cash, and cash bought influence faster than any bloodline could. That influence eventually produced an earldom, granted in the 1600s, and a marriage alliance that connects the Spencers directly to one of the most famous families in English history. In the early 1700s, a Spencer daughter married into the Churchill line, the family of John Churchill, the first Duke of Marlborough, and the two houses became so entangled that the Dukes of Marlborough have carried the surname Spencer-Churchill ever since. 2.5 centuries later, that same branch of the family produced Sir Winston Churchill, which makes Sarah Spencer, and Diana after her, distant cousins of the man who led Britain through the Second World War, a piece of family trivia that gets mentioned occasionally in royal coverage, and then dropped almost immediately, because it complicates the tidy version of the Spencers as a family whose only real historical function was supplying brides to princes. There is another Spencer woman worth knowing about before this story reaches Sarah, because her life maps onto the family's later pattern with an accuracy that borders on eerie. Georgiana Spencer, born in 1757, married William Cavendish, the 5th Duke of Devonshire, at the age of 17, and became, almost overnight, one of the most famous women in England, celebrated for her beauty, her fashion sense, and her genuine political influence, at a time when women were not supposed to have any. Her marriage was also, behind the glamour, a genuine ordeal. The Duke openly kept a mistress, Lady Elizabeth Foster, who eventually moved into the family home and lived alongside Georgiana and her husband, in an arrangement the entire fashionable world knew about and gossiped over for years, while Georgiana herself struggled for a decade to produce a male heir, suffered under crushing gambling debts she kept hidden from her husband, and eventually had an affair of her own that produced a daughter she was forced to give up. Historians who have written about her since have repeatedly, and with good reason, described her life as an unmistakable template for Diana's, a beautiful, glamorous Spencer woman married into extraordinary privilege, sharing her husband's affection with another woman the entire fashionable world knew about, trapped in a public role that offered her enormous visibility and almost no actual power over her own circumstances. Georgiana died in 1806, worn down as much by the strain of that life as by any specific illness, not quite 50 years old. Set next to Georgiana's story, the pattern this account has been tracing through the Boleyns, through Wallis Simpson, through Princess Margaret, and finally through Sarah Spencer's own courtship with Charles, starts to look less like a string of separate coincidences and more like something closer to a family inheritance in its own right, a specific and recurring vulnerability that seems to attach itself to Spencer women in particular whenever one of them marries at the very top of English society. Sarah, whatever she actually knew of Georgiana's story when she was 22 and falling into her own version of it, had at least one thing her ancestor never had: the freedom, however hard won, to walk away before the arrangement had a chance to close around her completely. It is worth sitting with that complication for a moment, because it cuts against the version of this story that treats Sarah, and later Diana, as young women plucked from relative obscurity by a glamorous royal family, doing them an enormous favor. The Spencers were never obscure. By any reasonable measure of English social standing, the Spencer earldom sat comfortably above a great deal of the aristocracy the royal family itself was drawn from, and Althorp, the house at the center of all of it, had been collecting art, furniture, and portraits by the finest painters in Europe for 300 years before Sarah ever brought a prince home for the weekend. When Sarah Spencer stood across a shooting lunch from Charles in 1976, she stood there as the daughter of one old, wealthy, well-connected English family, taking a serious look at the heir of another, not as a commoner awed by royalty, and the imbalance of power between them had far less to do with bloodline or money than with the much narrower, much stranger fact that only one of those two families had a crown attached to it. It is worth being concrete about what that crown actually brought with it financially, because the imbalance was real, even if it was not the imbalance the tabloids of the era assumed. The royal family's income flowed, and still flows, primarily through two enormous hereditary estates: the Duchy of Lancaster, which funds the sovereign personally, and the Duchy of Cornwall, which by ancient custom funds whoever holds the title Prince of Wales. The Duchy of Cornwall alone controlled, even in the 1970s, tens of thousands of acres of land across England, along with a substantial commercial property portfolio, generating an income that dwarfed anything even a grand aristocratic estate like Althorp could produce on its own. Althorp was genuinely wealthy by any ordinary measure, its art collection alone worth a considerable fortune, but it was the wealth of a large private landowner, subject to the same death duties, agricultural downturns, and maintenance costs, that had forced plenty of comparable estates into decline across the 20th century. The Duchy of Cornwall was something categorically different, an income stream attached permanently to an office, rather than to a family's fluctuating fortunes, immune in practice to most of the financial pressures that occasionally forced even grand families like the Spencers to sell land, art, or heirlooms to keep a house like Althorp standing, exactly as Rain would later be accused of doing, to keep the roof over everyone's head after she remarried into the family. In straightforward financial terms, Sarah was marrying into an entirely different category of institution altogether, not simply marrying up, one whose wealth existed to fund a public role rather than simply to sustain a private family, a distinction that mattered a great deal more to what her life would have actually looked like than any comparison of net worth ever could. Running a house the size of Althorp in the 1970s required a permanent staff numbering in the dozens, groundskeepers, gamekeepers for the shooting operation, domestic staff to maintain a house with well over 100 rooms, and the specialized conservators any collection of the estate's quality eventually needs to keep paintings and furniture from deteriorating, all of it funded by a combination of agricultural rents, the same death duties and inheritance taxes that had already forced the sale of land and heirlooms from comparable estates across the country, and, increasingly through this period, ticketed public access to parts of the house and grounds, a revenue stream nearly every surviving stately home of this scale eventually had to adopt in some form to keep the enterprise solvent. Sarah grew up watching her own father manage exactly this kind of balancing act, and she would have understood, in a way few outsiders fully appreciated, that even a family as grand as the Spencers operated under real financial constraints that the Crown's own income, by contrast, was largely insulated from. One more concrete illustration of the gap between old money and institutional money that shaped every part of this story. The family's own motto, "God defend the right," carved into stonework and stitched into livery across the estate for centuries, captures something of the self-image that wealth and standing produced. A family that saw itself as answerable to its own conscience and its own long history, rather than as supplicant to any other power, the Crown very much included. That self-conception is easy to lose sight of in a story so thoroughly dominated, in the popular imagination, by the image of a nervous young commoner awed by royal attention. Sarah Spencer was raised inside a family that had spent 3 centuries understanding itself as a peer of the institution she was being courted by, not a subject of it, and that inherited sense of standing on equal ground may be as good an explanation as any for why she felt able to say no to a prince in a way that a woman raised with less inherited confidence in her own family's worth might never have found the nerve to attempt. That house was Althorp, and the family was old enough that its involvement with the Crown did not begin with Sarah, or with her father, or even with her grandfather. Spencers had been marrying into the aristocracy that surrounded the monarchy for centuries, but the branch that matters here starts properly with Sarah's grandfather, the 7th Earl Spencer, who served the royal household directly, and with her father, Edward John Spencer, known to everyone as Johnny, who spent years as an equerry to King George VI and then to the young Queen Elizabeth II. An equerry is a kind of glorified aide, the person who manages a royal's schedule and stands slightly behind them at official functions, and it is a job you get not by applying for it, but because your family has already proven, over generations, that it can be trusted near the Crown without embarrassing it. Johnny Spencer got that job because he was a Spencer, and by the time his own children were born, the family's proximity to the royal family was not an aspiration. They simply lived there, literally. Diana was born at Park House, a property the Spencers rented directly from the royal family on the Sandringham estate, close enough that the young princesses, and later a young Prince Charles, were practically neighbors. Military service ran through the Spencer men across these same generations almost as consistently as royal proximity did, and the two traditions were not unrelated. Johnny Spencer himself served as a captain in the Royal Scots Greys during the Second World War, seeing action in Italy, and that record of service was itself part of what made him a credible candidate for the kind of trusted household position he later held. The pattern extended backward and forward, Spencer sons across several generations, passing through the Guards regiments or the cavalry, before settling into the estate management and public duties that came with inheriting Althorp, a rhythm of service first, land management second, that gave the family a kind of institutional respectability the royal household valued highly when assessing which outside families could be trusted with genuine access. Sarah grew up inside that expectation as much as her brother eventually did, absorbing a family culture in which duty, discretion, and a certain plain-spoken toughness were valued considerably more than the decorative accomplishments, music, painting, needlework, that filled the curriculum at schools like West Heath. A tension between what she was formally taught and what her own family actually modeled for her that may help explain why the bluntness came so naturally when the moment finally called for it. That proximity became an active part of the Spencer children's upbringing from the earliest years anyone can document, not merely a passive fact of geography. Hark House sat close enough to Sandringham House itself that the two families' children genuinely did play together as small children, Sarah and her siblings included, running across the same grounds the Queen and her own family used for their annual Christmas and New Year retreat. Prince Andrew and Prince Edward, born in the early 1960s, were close enough in age to the younger Spencer children that informal playdates between the two households were, if not routine, at least unremarkable, the sort of thing that happened between neighbors of similar rank without needing to be arranged as a formal occasion. Charles, considerably older, being born in 1948, would not have been part of that same nursery set, but he too grew up understanding Sandringham's neighboring families, the Spencers among them, as simply part of the fixed social landscape of his own childhood, familiar in the specific, low-grade way that people who have always lived near each other are familiar, long before any of it carried the weight of romance or scandal. The connection ran deeper still, and through a more personal channel than shared geography alone. Sarah's paternal grandmother, Cynthia Spencer, the wife of the 7th Earl, served for decades as a lady-in-waiting to Queen Elizabeth, the future Queen Mother, a role considerably more intimate than a simple job title suggests, involving daily companionship, personal confidence, and a level of trust the royal family did not extend casually or often. That relationship meant the Spencer family was not merely socially adjacent to the royal household by the time Sarah was born, but was known personally, at the most senior level, by the matriarch who still, well into the 1970s, held enormous informal influence over which families the wider royal circle considered suitable. When Sarah's own name began circulating as a plausible bride for Charles, she arrived already known rather than as an unknown quantity being vetted from scratch, the granddaughter of a woman the Queen Mother had trusted with her own daily life for years, which goes a long way toward explaining how quickly and how seriously the possibility of a Spencer marriage was taken by an institution that did not extend that seriousness lightly. Cynthia Spencer's own public life extended well beyond her service to the Queen Mother. During the Second World War, she had served as the county's leading figure in organizing the Northamptonshire branch of the Red Cross and the local nursing services, a role that earned her considerable public respect independent of her royal connections, and that placed her, alongside her husband's own wartime record, at the center of the county's civic life for decades. She died in 1972, 3 years before Sarah's own courtship with Charles began, but her decades of service had already cemented the family's reputation with the royal household so thoroughly that her death did nothing to loosen the connection, proof of how these relationships, once established at this level of intimacy, tended to outlast any single person who had built them. Johnny Spencer's own view of his daughter's courtship, insofar as it survives in the record at all, appears to have been one of straightforward, undisguised pleasure at the prospect, which is worth noting given how carefully this account has otherwise avoided putting words in anyone's mouth. As a former equerry who had spent years in close personal service to the royal family, Johnny understood exactly what a marriage between his eldest daughter and the Prince of Wales would mean for the family's standing, and by the accounts of people who knew him socially during this period, he made little effort to hide his hope that the relationship would end in a wedding. That hope, unfulfilled with Sarah, would be granted to him 4 years later with Diana instead, and by most accounts he was, by then, delighted twice over in a way. First by the possibility with his eldest daughter, and later by the reality with his youngest. Even if the second outcome would eventually cause the family considerably more grief than the first one ever did. Before any of that, in 1969, while he was still a Cambridge undergraduate, Charles was formally invested as Prince of Wales in a televised ceremony at Caernarfon Castle in North Wales, an elaborate piece of state theatre watched by an estimated 500 million people around the world, staged partly to shore up the monarchy's relevance at a moment of rising Welsh nationalism, and partly, as these ceremonies always are, to remind the public exactly which 20-year-old they should expect to eventually inherit the throne. He knelt before his mother in a specially commissioned crown and ermine-trimmed robe, swore an oath of fealty, and was, from that moment forward, no longer simply the Queen's eldest son, but a constitutional office in his own right, a role with its own household, its own income from the Duchy of Cornwall, and its own explicit expectation that he would, in due course, produce an heir to carry the whole apparatus forward another generation. He was 20 years old, and the ceremony left him with a title that made every subsequent relationship he attempted, Sarah Spencer's included, a matter of public constitutional interest, rather than simply personal choice. A distinction worth remembering every time this account describes a shooting weekend or a ski trip as though it were an ordinary courtship, because by 1969, there was no longer any such thing available to him. The title itself carries a weight considerably older than any of this, worth understanding briefly before moving on. Prince of Wales dates back to the conquest of Wales by King Edward I in the 1300s, and the tradition of granting it to the English monarch's eldest son, according to a story with more legend attached to it than solid documentation, supposedly began when Edward presented his infant son to the Welsh as a prince born on Welsh soil who spoke no English, a piece of political theatre that, true or embellished, set the pattern for nearly 7 centuries of English and later British monarchs, using the title to signal succession. By the time it landed on Charles in 1969, the title had already passed through more than 20 predecessors, some of whom, like the future Edward VIII, whose own crisis this account has already covered, wore it for decades without ever becoming king at all. A reminder that the position Charles occupied throughout his entire courtship of Sarah Spencer was itself a kind of extended waiting room, a role defined almost entirely by anticipation of a job that could not begin until his own mother's death, which did not arrive until he was 73 years old, more than half a century after Sarah Spencer first met him. Charles's own path through young adulthood ran along a track that had been laid out for him, with almost as little room for improvisation as anything expected of Sarah or Diana. After Gordonstoun, he went up to Trinity College, Cambridge, in 1967, the first heir to the throne in British history to earn a university degree, studying archaeology and anthropology before switching to history, and by most accounts of dons who taught him, he was a serious, somewhat withdrawn student who took his work more earnestly than his position technically required. He followed his degree with several years of active service in the Royal Navy and briefly the Royal Air Force, training as a helicopter pilot and eventually commanding a minesweeper, a period of his life he later described with more evident enthusiasm than almost anything else in his official biography, the closest thing to ordinary competitive achievement, judged on ability rather than birth, that his position ever allowed him. By the time that naval career wound down in the mid-1970s and the search for a bride began in earnest, Charles was approaching 30, having spent his entire adult life inside institutions, school, university, the armed forces, that had each in their own way tried to treat him like anyone else, and each, in the end, had to acknowledge that he plainly was not. Sarah, the eldest, arrived first, in 1955. Her sister Jane came 2 years later. A son, John, was born in 1960 and died within hours, a loss that would sit unspoken at the center of the family for years, and that shaped almost everything that came after it, including the pressure that fell squarely on the next child to be born, to finally produce a Spencer son and heir. That child was Diana, born the following year, and when she too turned out to be a girl, the disappointment was, by every account that has since come out of that household, real and not particularly well hidden. A son, Charles, finally arrived in 1964, 4 years after the loss of the first boy. and by most tellings, the arrival of a male heir did not repair what had already begun to come apart in that marriage. Johnny and his wife Frances divorced in 1969, in a custody battle so vicious and so exhaustively covered by the newspapers that it became, in its own smaller way, a kind of dress rehearsal for the media storms that would later follow Diana. Frances's own mother, Ruth, Lady Fermoy, testified against her in court, a betrayal made considerably stranger by the fact that Lady Fermoy was, like Sarah's paternal grandmother, a lady-in-waiting to the Queen Mother, meaning both of the grandmothers in this family owed their closest personal loyalty to the same royal household their own grandchildren would later marry into, a detail that makes the custody battle read less like an ordinary family rupture and more like the institution's own values, discretion, loyalty to appearances over personal candor, reaching directly into a Spencer marriage and helping to end it from the inside. Frances lost custody of all 4 of her surviving children. Sarah was 14 years old when that happened, old enough to understand exactly what was being decided and exactly how publicly it was being fought over. She had already learned, before she ever met a prince, that being born into a family the newspapers found interesting meant your private life could become a public argument, with almost no warning and no way to stop it. Frances herself did not disappear from her children's lives after losing custody, though the terms of that era's divorce settlements meant her role was permanently diminished in a way that would be almost unthinkable under modern family law. She remarried in 1969 to Peter Shand Kidd, a wallpaper heir, and the couple eventually settled on a farm on the Scottish island of Sale, a small, windswept island connected to the mainland only by a single humpbacked stone bridge, ringed by sheep pasture and cold water locks, about as far removed from the social orbit of Althorp and the royal family as it was possible to get while remaining in the United Kingdom. The 4 Spencer children spent school holidays travelling between 2 very different worlds, their father's increasingly grand aristocratic household in Northamptonshire and their mother's considerably quieter, more remote life in Scotland, an arrangement that by most later accounts left all of them, Sarah included, with a complicated and somewhat guarded relationship to the idea of family stability. Diana, in particular, spoke later in life about the lasting effect of watching her parents' marriage collapse in public, and biographers of the family have often traced her eventual difficulty trusting the institution she married into back to those earliest lessons about what happens when a family's private business becomes a subject other people feel entitled to litigate. Sarah, 4 years older, and therefore 4 years further along in absorbing that lesson by the time she met Charles, arrived at her own courtship already fluent in exactly the kind of guardedness the role would have demanded of her, whether or not she ever articulated it to herself in those terms. Jane, the second Spencer sister, deserves a mention here too, because her own adult life produced one of the stranger ironies in this entire family's relationship with the institution at its center. In 1978, the same year Sarah's romance with Charles was fizzling out, Jane married Robert Fellows, a courtier who would go on to become the Queen's private secretary, effectively the most senior civil servant in the royal household, and the person responsible for managing the institution's affairs at the very highest level. That meant one Spencer sister ended up married directly into the palace machinery itself, working from the inside of the very apparatus that had spent the previous 2 years photographing her older sister on ski slopes and picking apart her love life in the tabloids, a position that put Jane, uniquely among the 4 Spencer children, on the institution's side of the glass, rather than in front of it. It also meant that when Diana's marriage began to unravel years later, one of her own sisters was married to a man whose professional loyalty ran, by necessity, to the Queen and to the institution, rather than to Diana personally, a genuinely awkward family arrangement that surfaces only briefly in most accounts of this period, but that adds one more layer to how thoroughly the Spencer family, across all 3 sisters, found itself entangled with the royal household in ways that had nothing to do with any of them ever formally marrying into it. She was educated at West Heath, a girls' boarding school near Sevenoaks in Kent that would later educate Diana as well, run for decades by a headmistress named Ruth Rudge, who by later accounts placed less emphasis on rigorous academics than on what the school's own prospectus described as good citizenship, encouraging pupils toward practical skills, community service, and the kind of poise expected of a certain class of young Englishwoman, rather than toward examination results or university preparation. It was, in other words, exactly the sort of institution built to produce precisely the outcome described a moment ago. Competent, socially fluent young women, equipped for a specific narrow role, and given very little institutional encouragement to imagine any other one. Sarah left it the way a great many girls of her class and generation left school in the 1970s, without exams that mattered much, and without any expectation that she needed them. What Sarah had instead was a personality that made an impression on almost everyone who met her. People who knew her in those years described someone funny, blunt, a strong rider who was more comfortable on a horse than in a ballroom, and someone with almost no patience for pretense. She worked, at various points, behind the counter of a London bookshop, ringing up customers and shelving stock the same as any other employee, and later, in a public relations firm, learning the basic mechanics of managing other people's images for a living. Unglamorous jobs that she does not appear to have needed financially, and took anyway, which tells you something about a woman who did not particularly want to sit at home, waiting for her life to happen to her. And at some point in the mid-1970s, that personality caught the attention of the Prince of Wales. Riding, in particular, deserves a moment of its own here, because it was not simply a hobby for Sarah, in the way it was for many young women of her class. She hunted regularly with local hunts near Althorp, competed in point-to-point races, the informal amateur steeplechases that formed a central part of country social life throughout this period, and was known among people who rode with her as genuinely skilled rather than merely enthusiastic, someone who took real physical risks on horseback without hesitation. That comfort with risk, with a sport that regularly produced broken bones and occasional worse among its participants, tracks closely with everything else this account has established about her temperament, a woman who did not flinch from things that frightened other people, whether that meant a difficult jump on a hunting morning or a direct answer to a reporter's question about marrying a prince. It is worth noting, too, that the specific sport Sarah excelled at would itself become politically fraught within a generation, as fox hunting, the activity underpinning the point-to-point races and the local hunts she rode with, drew growing public and parliamentary opposition through the final decades of the 20th century, culminating in the Hunting Act of 2004, which banned hunting foxes with dogs across England and Wales. Diana, by contrast, never shared her sister's enthusiasm for riding or hunting in any serious way, a small but genuine difference in temperament between the two sisters that tends to get erased in retellings, eager to treat all four Spencer children as interchangeable products of the same aristocratic mold. Sarah was, in the fullest sense, a countrywoman. Diana, for all her own genuine love of the outdoors, was something closer to a city dweller who happened to grow up in the country, a distinction that shaped how comfortably each sister ultimately settled into the specific demands of the different lives they each eventually led. The hunt ball, the formal evening gathering that traditionally closed out a day's hunting, deserves a brief mention here too, since it sat at the exact intersection of the two worlds Sarah moved between, the physical, muddy, competence-tested world of the hunt itself, and the more performative, formally dressed world of the evening social calendar that followed it. A woman who could hold her own across both halves of that single day, competent on horseback by morning and composed in evening dress by night, without visible strain in either register, was demonstrating precisely the kind of versatility the wider aristocratic marriage market prized most highly, and Sarah, by every account, managed that transition as naturally as anyone of her generation. To understand how unusual it was for a young woman of Sarah's background to have any career at all, however modest, you have to understand what the system that raised her had actually been designed to produce: brides rather than employees, and until remarkably recently, the entire machinery for producing them had run through a formal ritual called the season, a calendar of balls, garden parties, and social events that stretched from spring through summer in London, and that existed for one publicly acknowledged purpose: giving upper-class families a controlled environment in which to introduce their 18-year-old daughters to a pool of eligible young men from equivalent families. At the center of the old version of the season sat presentation at court, a ceremony in which debutantes, dressed in white and trained for months in how to curtsy correctly to the sovereign, were formally introduced to the reigning monarch as a mark that they had officially entered adult society and were now, in the blunt language nobody used out loud but everyone understood, available. That specific ceremony ended in 1958, when the young Queen Elizabeth abolished formal presentations at court, reportedly on the advice of Prince Philip, who thought the whole practice had become an outdated embarrassment. But abolishing the ceremony did not abolish the system underneath it. The season itself continued for another decade and more, run by the same small network of society hostesses who had organized it for generations, and even after it faded as a formal institution through the 1960s and 70s, the assumptions that had built it did not fade nearly as quickly. Girls from families like the Spencers were still, well into the decade Sarah came of age in, raised with an implicit understanding that their education existed to produce a certain kind of adult, socially fluent, capable of running a large household, comfortable at a shoot or a hunt ball, and not particularly encouraged to think of a university degree or a serious profession as the natural next step after school. This was simply the water her entire generation of upper-class English women swam in, not a pattern specific to Sarah alone, and it explains why a woman as sharp and as blunt as Sarah Spencer left West Heath with no exam results anyone thought to mention, and went, not into further study, but into a bookshop, and then into public relations, jobs that were considered perfectly respectable ways for a woman of her background to occupy the years between school and marriage, without actually needing to be taken seriously as a career. Alongside the broader social training of the season sat a considerably more specific and rigid set of rules governing exactly how a person was expected to behave in the actual presence of a member of the royal family, rules Sarah would have absorbed from childhood simply by growing up in a household where her own father had spent years enforcing them professionally. A woman was expected to curtsy on first greeting a royal and again on parting, never to initiate physical contact, never to ask a personal question unless invited to, and never to turn her back on a senior royal while withdrawing from a room, small physical courtesies that added up to a constant, low-level performance of deference that had to be maintained even during the most ordinary, unglamorous moments of a courtship, over breakfast, on a shooting field, in a car. None of these rules were unique to romantic partners. They applied to everyone who came into regular contact with the family. But for a woman being seriously considered as a bride, they took on an additional weight, since any lapse, a forgotten curtsy, an overly familiar joke told at the wrong moment, could be read by an unforgiving press and an equally unforgiving set of courtiers as evidence that she did not yet understand what she was signing up for. Forms of address carried their own precise rules as well. Sir and ma'am on first use and thereafter, Your Royal Highness reserved for the most formal occasions, and a whole unwritten hierarchy of who was permitted to use a first name and under what circumstances, rules that shifted depending on how well established a relationship had become, and that a woman still early in her courtship had to navigate with almost no formal instruction, learning largely by observation and by the quiet correction of anyone in the room senior enough to offer it. Sarah again had an advantage here that neither Diana nor most of Charles's other girlfriends possessed to the same degree, having watched her own father navigate exactly this hierarchy professionally for years, absorbing by simple proximity a fluency in royal protocol that most 22-year-olds anywhere in England would have found bewildering. Diana would go through an almost identical version of this same pipeline 4 years later, attending the same school, leaving with the same absence of academic distinction, and drifting into the same category of pleasant, undemanding work, first as a nanny and cleaner for her own sister Jane's household, then at the Young England kindergarten in Pimlico, where she was working when Charles's attention turned toward her. Neither sister was unintelligent. Both were, by every account of people who actually knew them, sharper and more perceptive than the system that raised them gave them credit for. But the system was not built to measure that, or particularly to reward it. It was built to produce exactly the kind of young woman who could walk into a shooting party at Althorp or Sandringham, know instinctively which fork to use and which topics to avoid, and never once embarrass the family whose name she carried, which is a very specific and very narrow kind of competence, one that has almost nothing to do with the sort of judgment a person actually needs to survive a marriage into the institution at the center of it all. One further legal mechanism sat quietly behind all of this. rarely discussed in the moment but always present in the background of any serious royal courtship in this period. The Royal Marriages Act of 1772 required any descendant of King George II, a category that obviously included Charles, to obtain the sovereign's formal consent before marrying. On pain of the marriage being declared void, a law originally passed after George III grew furious at two of his own brothers, the Duke of Cumberland and the Duke of Gloucester, who had each secretly married commoners, wealthy widows outside the aristocracy, without seeking his approval, marriages the king considered such an affront to the dignity of the crown that he pushed the legislation through Parliament, specifically to prevent it from happening again. In practice, this meant that no matter how far a courtship between Charles and any woman progressed, whether Sarah Spencer, Anna Wallis, or eventually Diana, the relationship remained provisional, in a legal sense, until the Queen herself formally signed off on it, a layer of parental and institutional control written directly into statute that had no equivalent in the marriage of any ordinary British citizen. That law remained in force, essentially unchanged, until it was finally replaced by the considerably narrower Succession to the Crown Act of 2013, which limited the consent requirement to only the first 6 people in line to the throne, rather than the sprawling, centuries-deep pool of royal descendants the original act had covered. It is against that backdrop that Sarah's response to Charles's attention starts to look genuinely unusual, rather than simply blunt for its own sake. The system that raised her had spent roughly 2 decades preparing her to be chosen, and had given her almost no practice at choosing, or at declining to be chosen, on her own terms. That she did it anyway, at 22, while an entire country waited for her to say yes, is the part of this story that tends to get flattened into a single quotable line about dustmen, when the more interesting fact is, everything in her upbringing that should have made saying no considerably harder than it apparently was. The exact mechanics of how Charles and Sarah Spencer first spent real time together are less interesting than what happened once they had. They moved in the same world almost by default, the world of shooting parties and racing weekends, and the handful of country houses whose owners had known each other's families for generations, and by 1976, they were being seen together often enough that Fleet Street noticed. What followed was something closer to an audition than a whirlwind, conducted almost entirely in public, under conditions that no ordinary courtship has ever had to survive, and Sarah Spencer went through more of that audition, and got closer to passing it than almost anyone remembers today. Here is the shape of what actually happened to her, and why it matters more than the muddy field where her sister first said hello to a prince. Charles was not new to this by the time Sarah entered the picture. By 1976, he had already been called the world's most eligible bachelor for the better part of a decade, a title that sounds enviable and was, by most accounts, a fairly miserable way to spend your 20s. He had dated, or been linked to, a long list of women who each briefly carried the weight of national speculation before disappearing from the story. Lucia Santa Cruz, the daughter of a Chilean ambassador who was reportedly the first woman he was seriously involved with, Georgiana Russell, a diplomat's daughter, Davina Sheffield, who survived a genuinely brutal round of tabloid scrutiny into her private life before that relationship ended, and running underneath nearly all of it, on and off, the woman he had wanted to marry before duty and his family's disapproval intervened, Camilla Shand, who by the time Sarah Spencer came along had already married a cavalry officer named Andrew Parker Bowles and taken his name. Camilla was not gone from Charles's life. She was, by the account of nearly everyone who has written seriously about this period, never really gone from his life at all, a fact that would eventually matter enormously to a much younger woman standing in a field at Althorp, though not yet, and not for years. Davina Sheffield's story is worth pausing on briefly, because it is the ugliest single episode in this entire chain of relationships, and it set a precedent that hung over every woman who came after her, Sarah Spencer included. Sheffield's relationship with Charles, in the mid-1970s, ended after a newspaper published deeply personal claims about her private life before she met him, reporting that a former boyfriend had told journalists intimate details intended specifically to make her look unsuitable as a royal bride. The palace did nothing publicly to defend her. Charles, by most accounts, distanced himself from the relationship almost immediately once the story broke, unwilling to let the controversy attach itself to him, and Sheffield was left to absorb the damage to her own reputation entirely alone. A pattern of the institution protecting the prince, at the direct expense of the woman involved, that would repeat itself, in various forms, for the next 2 decades. Georgiana Russell, whose relationship with Charles predated Sheffield's, fared better only in the sense that her exit from the story was quieter, marrying a Spanish diplomat not long after, and largely avoiding the kind of press ordeal that followed Sheffield. Every woman on this list, in other words, had already demonstrated to anyone paying close attention exactly how little protection came attached to the position of the Prince of Wales's girlfriend, and exactly how quickly that protection could evaporate the moment the story stopped being convenient. Charles's own parents' marriage offered him a strange, contradictory model to draw on. Philip, a prince of Greece and Denmark with no fortune of his own and a genuinely difficult itinerant childhood behind him, had married into the institution himself in 1947, giving up his Greek and Danish titles and his naval career's independence to become the Queen's consort, a role that placed him, by his own later description, permanently one step behind his wife, in a country and a culture that did not entirely know what to do with a husband who could never actually rule. Philip made that adjustment, by most accounts, only imperfectly and with considerable private frustration, and observers of the family have long argued that his own experience of subordinating himself to the institution shaped, directly or indirectly, the somewhat rigid, duty-first model of marriage he and the Queen presented to their children, Charles very much included. Charles grew up watching a marriage that worked, in the sense that it lasted and functioned as a public partnership, but that offered him very little evidence of what an emotionally open, mutually vulnerable marriage between equals might actually look like, which goes some distance toward explaining why, when it came time to choose his own wife, he seems to have searched primarily for suitability rather than for the kind of connection his parents' own marriage had never modeled for him in the first place. To understand why Charles approached the search for a wife the way he did, cautious, drawn to women who challenged him, yet ultimately unable to commit to any of them, it helps to look briefly at the man doing the searching, because very little about his own upbringing had prepared him to make that decision with any real confidence. He was sent, at 13, to Gordonston, a famously Spartan boarding school in the north of Scotland that his father Prince Philip had attended and had insisted his son attend as well, built around cold showers, early morning runs, and a philosophy of character building through discomfort that Charles later described, in language about as blunt as he ever allowed himself in public, as closer to Colditz than to a school. He was, by his own later account, and by the account of people who knew him there, lonely and frequently miserable, a sensitive, introspective boy, dropped into an environment explicitly designed to stamp out sensitivity and introspection. His relationship with his own parents during these years was formal rather than warm, shaped by the same institutional habit of restraint that would later frustrate Diana so badly. And by his own admission, he grew up starved for the kind of demonstrative affection that gets called ordinary in most families and gets called weakness in his. What that upbringing produced, by the time Charles reached adulthood, was a man who found genuine, private satisfaction almost exclusively in solitary or semi-solitary pursuits, the kind of interests that did not require him to perform for an audience the way nearly every other part of his life demanded. He took up watercolor painting seriously in his 20s and continued it for the rest of his life, producing hundreds of amateur landscapes that he rarely showed outside a small circle. He developed an early and, for the time, somewhat unusual passion for organic farming and architecture, interests that made him a figure of considerable public mockery in the 1980s and 1990s, mocked in the press for talking to his plants and for campaigning against modern architecture he considered ugly, before large parts of the culture eventually caught up with positions on sustainable farming and traditional design that had once made him sound eccentric. He also retained, from childhood, a genuine love of the comic radio program The Goon Show, quoting its absurdist humor for decades and crediting it, in interviews late in life, as one of the few unambiguously happy connections to his own childhood. None of these interests made him an easier man to court or to marry, but they round out a portrait that the institutional analysis in this account might otherwise flatten into pure duty and pressure, a reminder that the same man weighing a bride against a checklist of dynastic requirements was also, in whatever private time the role allowed him, a person with genuine, unglamorous enthusiasms that had nothing to do with any of it. Those enthusiasms eventually found their fullest expression at Highgrove, the Gloucestershire estate Charles purchased for himself in 1980, the same year his courtship with Diana began, and which he transformed over the following decades into a working laboratory for exactly the interests that made him seem eccentric to his own generation. Organic farming methods applied at real commercial scale, elaborate formal gardens designed according to his own sometimes idiosyncratic taste, and an architectural sensibility that rejected the modernist trends dominant elsewhere in Britain at the time. Highgrove became, in a sense, the one place in his adult life that was genuinely his, rather than his family's or the institution's, purchased with his own income from the Duchy of Cornwall, rather than inherited, decorated according to his own instincts, rather than centuries of accumulated royal tradition, a private refuge that Diana, by most accounts of the marriage, never felt was equally hers, since it had already been fully shaped around Charles's own preferences, well before she ever moved into it as his wife. The person who filled that gap, more than either of his actual parents, was his great-uncle Louis Mountbatten, the last Viceroy of India and a towering, ambitious figure in his own right, who took an active, almost proprietary interest in shaping the young Prince of Wales from adolescence onward. Mountbatten wrote Charles letters. He gave him advice on everything from his naval career to his love life, and it is one specific piece of that advice, preserved in Charles's own authorized biography and quoted in nearly every serious account of this period since, that explains more about why Sarah Spencer's honesty landed so awkwardly than almost anything else in this story. Mountbatten's counsel, delivered repeatedly over the course of the 1970s, was that a young man in Charles's position ought to sow what he called his wild oats freely before settling down, but that when the time came to choose a wife, he should choose a suitable, sweet-charactered girl before she had a chance to meet anyone else she might fall for, someone with no romantic past of her own to complicate the marriage or embarrass the institution later. Read that advice again next to everything you now know about Sarah Spencer, and the shape of what happened between them comes into much sharper focus. Sarah was 22 when she met Charles, a woman who had already lived through her parents' divorce, already survived and spoken openly about an eating disorder, already worked ordinary jobs and formed ordinary opinions about what she wanted from a marriage. She was, by Mountbatten's own explicit standard, exactly the kind of candidate the institution was not supposed to be looking for, not because there was anything wrong with her, but because she had already had a life before Charles arrived in it. And a life meant a person capable of comparison, of judgment, of walking away if the terms were not good enough. Diana, 4 years later, fit the Mountbatten template almost perfectly. She was 19, had no prior serious relationship the papers could dig up, and had spent her short adult life in the kind of quiet, undemanding work that left her with very little basis for comparison when a prince's attention finally landed on her. Whether Charles was consciously applying his great-uncle's advice by the time he proposed to Diana in 1981 is impossible to know for certain, and this account will not pretend otherwise. But the pattern the advice describes, and the pattern the record actually shows, line up closely enough that it would be strange not to mention it. Mountbatten did not live to see that marriage. He was assassinated by the Provisional Irish Republican Army in August of 1979, killed by a bomb planted on his fishing boat off the coast of County Sligo, an attack that also killed his 14-year-old grandson and a young local boy working as a crew member. Charles, by every account of people close to him at the time, was devastated in a way that went beyond ordinary grief for a great-uncle. He had lost the one older man in his life who had given him something like unconditional attention at a moment when he was still without a wife, still searching, and increasingly, by his own later description, feeling the weight of turning 30 without having settled the one question the entire country kept asking him. That loss sits in the background of everything that happened over the following year, including the beginning of his courtship with Diana, and it is worth remembering, when that courtship is retold later in this account, that the man beginning it was not simply a prince looking for a bride on his own schedule, but a grieving one, recently reminded, in the most violent way possible, that the mentor who had spent a decade coaching him toward exactly this decision was no longer there to see how it turned out. Each of these women had been put through some version of the same process, a few photographs, a wave of speculation. Newspapermen camped outside a family home or a workplace. Headlines asking, in that breathless way the British press specialized in during this period, whether this was finally the one. And then, almost without exception, it ended, quietly or otherwise, and the search resumed. By the time Sarah Spencer's name started appearing in that same rotation, in late 1976 and into 1977, she was walking into a role that had already claimed several women before her, and would claim several more after. What made her different, and what almost nobody watching at the time seemed to fully register, was that she appeared to understand the trap before she was fully caught in it. She did not treat the attention as a prize. She did not perform the part the papers wanted her to play. And when the moment came to say, publicly, whether she saw a future in it, she said the one thing almost none of Charles's other girlfriends had dared to say out loud. That is where this story actually starts. Not with a wedding that never happened, and not with a sister waiting in the wings. It starts with a young woman who got closer to becoming Princess of Wales than history generally credits her for, who spent roughly 18 months finding out exactly what that position would cost her, and who walked away from it with her eyes fully open, years before her younger sister walked into the same trap without any warning at all. Had it gone the other way, had Sarah accepted rather than declined, the title waiting for her was not a small one. She would have become Princess of Wales, later Queen Consort, later still, in the ordinary course of succession, the woman standing beside a coronation, exactly like the one this account will eventually describe her attending as a guest, rather than as its central figure. Her children, had she had any with Charles, would have included the future King William, or someone occupying the position he now holds, a genealogical branch of the royal family that simply never came into existence because a 22-year-old decided, one afternoon, to tell a reporter the truth. It is worth sitting with the scale of what she turned down, not to romanticize the decision, but to make clear that this was never a minor choice, dressed up as a major one by hindsight. Sarah Spencer looked directly at the single largest opportunity offered to any Englishwoman of her generation and said, calmly and in print, that she would rather not. Had she said yes instead, the machinery that would have followed was already well established by tradition, and Sarah, of all people, understood it better than almost anyone else in her position, having watched her own father operate inside it for years. There would have been a formal request for the sovereign's consent under the Royal Marriages Act, a private audience with the Queen and the Queen Mother, to be personally approved rather than simply tolerated, an official engagement photo call on the palace grounds, months of dress fittings and wedding planning, conducted under a level of security and secrecy the tabloids would have found almost unbearable to be kept from, and finally a ceremony that would, in all likelihood, have rivaled or exceeded the one Diana eventually had, since by the time Sarah's relationship with Charles reached its peak in early 1978, the public appetite for exactly this spectacle was already fully primed and waiting. None of it happened. The mechanism was ready. The one person whose consent actually mattered most, the bride herself, simply never gave it. If you have watched enough of these documentaries to know what usually comes next, you already know the shape a story like this is supposed to take. Somebody falls for a prince. The papers turn it into a circus. It ends in tears, or worse. Stay with this one anyway, because Sarah Spencer's version breaks that pattern in a way that matters, and understanding exactly how she did it, and exactly what she saw in Charles that made her different from every other woman before Diana, is the only way to understand what happened 3 years later, in that same ploughed field, to a 16-year-old who was not paying attention to any of the warnings her own sister had already lived through. Before we go further, if channels like this one are how you like spending an afternoon, subscribing costs nothing, and it tells us to keep making them. There is a lot of ground to cover in this one, family history that most royal coverage skips entirely, a courtship the palace would clearly have preferred forgotten, and an ending that explains more about what happened to Diana than any documentary about Diana herself ever quite manages to. Settle in. The other thing worth understanding about Sarah Spencer, before you watch her walk into Charles's orbit, is that by the time she did, she had already survived something the newspapers of the era barely had language for. In her late teens, Sarah developed anorexia, and she later spoke about it publicly, at a time when almost nobody in her position did. This was not a footnote she buried. She discussed it with reporters directly, describing weeks spent existing on little more than an apple a day and the toll it took on her body and her family, and she credited a clinic and a course of treatment with pulling her out of it. Put that detail next to everything else you now know about her: the mother lost to a court battle, the brother who died before she turned 5, the sister born into a house already grieving that loss, and a different picture starts to form than the one the tabloids ran at the time. The papers wanted a fairy tale ingenue. What they got was a young woman who had already been through a genuine crisis and had talked about it in public before it was fashionable, let alone expected, to do so. That combination, the bluntness, the survived crisis, the refusal to perform gratitude for attention she had not asked for, is what Charles was apparently drawn to. People who wrote about the royal family during this period describe him as someone who had grown tired of women who treated him like an occasion rather than a person. Women who went stiff and formal the moment they realized who they were talking to. Sarah did not do that. By multiple contemporary accounts, she teased him, she argued with him, she treated him, within the fairly narrow limits that any relationship with the heir to the throne allowed, like an ordinary man. She happened to find good company, which for a person in Charles's position was apparently a rare and welcome experience. None of what happened next to Sarah, or later to Diana, can be understood without a basic sense of what the British press actually looked like at this moment, because the machinery that turned a private courtship into a national event was, in many ways, the main character of this story, rather than an incidental detail in it. By the mid-1970s, a small handful of tabloid newspapers, the Daily Mail, the Daily Express, the Sun, and the News of the World among them, were locked in increasingly aggressive competition for circulation, and royal coverage had become one of the most reliable ways to sell papers on a slow news day. This produced a distinct professional category, the royal correspondent, reporters who spent their entire careers cultivating sources inside the palace, inside the social circles the royal family moved through, and inside the households of anyone who might plausibly become the next royal bride. Some of these men became minor celebrities in their own right. James Whittaker, who covered the royal family for decades, and was nicknamed the Fleet Street Tarantula for his tenacity, built an entire career around exactly this kind of pursuit, and by the time Sarah Spencer's name entered the rotation of likely candidates, reporters like him had already refined a set of tactics, staking out family homes, cultivating servants and school friends as sources, chartering helicopters to follow ski trips that had no real precedent in how any other category of public figure was covered. The financial incentives behind this coverage are worth stating plainly, because they explain why the intensity kept escalating rather than settling into some sustainable equilibrium. A single well-timed photograph of a plausible royal bride could be worth a significant sum to the newspaper that got it first, and an exclusive interview, however brief, was worth considerably more. This created a structural pressure that had nothing to do with genuine public interest and everything to do with commerce, in which each new candidate for Charles's attention was effectively worth money to a large number of people the moment her name became linked to his, whether she had agreed to any of it or not. Sarah Spencer, and every woman before and after her on that list, was, in the coldest possible sense, a commercial asset rather than simply a subject of gossip, one that neither she nor her family had any say in creating. The competitive pressure behind all of this intensified further just as Sarah's own story was unfolding, because 1969 was the year Rupert Murdoch, then a comparatively young Australian media proprietor, acquired The Sun and relaunched it as an aggressive, down-market tabloid explicitly designed to outsell its rivals through sensation rather than restraint. Murdoch went on to acquire the News of the World the same year, and, later, the more upmarket Times and Sunday Times as well, assembling a media empire that treated the royal family as one of its most reliable and renewable sources of circulation across every title he owned. The Sun, under Murdoch's ownership, grew into Britain's best-selling newspaper through exactly the period covered by this account, and its competitive pressure on rival papers to match or exceed its coverage of anything royal, anything romantic, anything involving a young woman photographed near a prince, pushed the entire industry toward tactics that would have seemed excessive only a decade earlier. Sarah Spencer had the comparative good fortune of being pursued by this machinery before it had fully matured into the version that would later stake out Diana's kindergarten tap phones, and ultimately chase a car through a Paris tunnel. She still experienced its earliest, most aggressive phase directly, which is a large part of why she understood, faster and more clearly than almost anyone else in her position, exactly how little any of it was actually going to leave her alone once it decided she mattered. The institution's own security apparatus offered little relief from any of this, because it was built to protect royal persons from physical threats, assassination, kidnapping, the genuine dangers a monarchy has always had to guard against, rather than to shield a prince's girlfriend from a photographer with a long lens. The Metropolitan Police's Royalty Protection Squad, staffed by armed officers assigned to guard the Queen and her immediate family at all times, had no formal mandate to extend that protection to a woman like Sarah Spencer, who remained, throughout her entire relationship with Charles, a private citizen in the eyes of the same state apparatus that would happily have thrown a security cordon around him. She got some informal protection simply by proximity, traveling in the same cars, staying at the same houses, but she navigated the press pack essentially unshielded, a gap in coverage that the institution never seriously tried to close for any of the women in this position until considerably later, after Diana's own experience of exactly the same vulnerability had already produced consequences nobody could undo. Alongside the dedicated royal correspondents like Whittaker sat an equally influential and, in its own way, even more feared institution, the gossip column, led during exactly this period by figures like Nigel Dempster, whose column for the Daily Mail made and unmade social reputations across the entire English upper class, not just the royal family, through a mixture of genuine reporting and carefully cultivated society sources, who fed him material in exchange for favourable coverage of themselves. The Daily Express ran a rival column under the historic William Hickey name, another fixture of this same ecosystem, and between them these columns functioned as a kind of ongoing, semi-authorized surveillance of exactly the social world Sarah Spencer belonged to, turning dinner parties and shooting weekends into raw material with a speed and a permanence that had no real precedent before television and mass circulation newspapers made it possible. A young woman moving through that world in the mid-1970s was never really off the record, whether she understood it in those terms or not, because someone at nearly every gathering she attended had at least the potential to be a source for one of these columns, whether a fellow guest, a member of staff, or simply an acquaintance looking to trade a piece of gossip for their own name appearing favorably in print. Camera technology itself was changing rapidly through exactly this period, in ways that made all of this considerably easier to execute than it had been even a decade earlier. Long telephoto lenses capable of capturing a sharp, publishable image from several hundred yards away had become affordable enough for freelance photographers to buy and carry as standard equipment. Motor drives allowed a single photographer to fire off a dozen frames in the time it once took to manually advance and shoot one, and a growing freelance photography market meant that a single well-timed image of Sarah Spencer, taken by someone with no formal press credentials at all, could be sold directly to the highest-bidding newspaper for a sum that made the pursuit worthwhile, even for photographers working entirely outside any newsroom's payroll. This decentralized, market-driven model of celebrity photography, in which almost anyone with the right equipment and enough patience could become a temporary paparazzo for a single valuable shot, is part of what made the coverage of Sarah, and later Diana, so difficult to contain through any formal agreement with editors, since the actual photographs increasingly came from people no editor employed, and therefore had no real power over. It is against this backdrop that Sarah's decision to speak candidly to a reporter reads as considerably more strategic than it is usually given credit for. The alternative to speaking, as every other woman on Charles's list had already discovered, was not silence. Silence did not actually protect anyone from coverage, because the newspapers filled the silence themselves, with speculation, with unnamed sources, with confident predictions about engagement dates that had no basis in anything Sarah had actually said. By giving a direct, on-the-record answer, she took a certain amount of control over her own story, back from a press machine that had, up to that point, been writing it for her without her input. Whether that decision was fully deliberate, or simply an honest woman answering an honest question, without thinking through the consequences, the effect was the same either way. For a brief moment, in 1977, one of Fleet Street's most reliable subjects, refused to play the part the story required of her, and the newspapers, who had built an entire commercial apparatus around the assumption that royal girlfriends stayed quiet and let the speculation build, genuinely did not know what to do with her once she stopped. It is worth noting how little institutional support existed, on the palace's own side, to help any of these women navigate that machinery in the first place. The royal household's press operation in the 1970s was small, reactive, and built almost entirely around managing the Queen's own public appearances, rather than protecting the private lives of the young women being drawn into her son's orbit. There was no formal media training offered to Sarah, no communications professional assigned to help her understand what she could or could not safely say to a reporter, no coordinated strategy for handling a story that had, by any reasonable measure, become a matter of genuine public fascination. She was, in effect, handed to the press with no more preparation than any other 22-year-old would have had, and expected to somehow intuit the rules of an entirely new kind of scrutiny that no handbook existed to explain. That same institutional gap would prove far more consequential a few years later, when a considerably younger and less experienced Diana was thrown into an even more intense version of the same environment, with barely more preparation than Sarah had received. And it would take the sustained crisis of Diana's own marriage, and eventually her death, before the palace built anything resembling the modern communications operation that exists today, complete with trained press secretaries, coordinated messaging, and an explicit strategy for managing exactly the kind of media pressure that neither Sarah nor Diana had any real institutional shield against in their own time. King Charles's household now operates with a media sophistication that would have been unrecognizable to the man who once let Sarah Spencer face down Fleet Street entirely on her own. Their relationship became visible to the public gradually, through the usual channels available to the press at the time: sightings at shooting parties, at race meetings, at the sort of country house weekends that made up the calendar of that world. By early 1977, the newspapers had settled on Sarah as the leading candidate, the woman most likely to become the next Princess of Wales, and they began covering her with the intensity that designation guaranteed. Every dress she wore to a public event was analysed, her preference for tailored country wear and simple, unfussy evening dresses over the more elaborate fashions some of her contemporaries favoured, treated by style columnists as its own kind of coded statement about her personality, practical rather than showy, substance over spectacle, exactly the reading the newspapers wanted to give a woman they had already decided was destined for the role. Every photograph of her standing near Charles was captioned with speculation about engagement rings and wedding dates that did not exist yet, and, as it turned out, never would. Several papers went further still, running reader polls and features, inviting the public to weigh in on which of Charles's rumoured girlfriends would make the best princess. A piece of participatory tabloid theatre that turned Sarah Spencer's private life into something closer to a contest, with an actual scoreboard. Her photograph placed alongside those of other rumoured candidates, for readers to rank by whatever criteria a Tuesday morning feature writer decided mattered that week: breeding, beauty, poise, the ability to produce an heir. It is difficult to overstate how strange this would have been to live through, to open a newspaper and find yourself being formally compared against strangers as a marriage prospect for a man you were, at that point, still simply dating. And it offers as clear a picture as anything in this account of exactly how thoroughly the press had already stopped treating Sarah as a private person, making a private choice, months before she ever gave the interview that would try, belatedly, to take that choice back. Strip away the speculation and the photographs, and what the courtship itself actually consisted of, week to week, was considerably more ordinary than the coverage suggested. It was dinners at friends' houses, weekends at Sandringham or Balmoral, where the wider royal family could take the measure of her at closer range than any newspaper photograph allowed, evenings at the theatre or at friends' parties, where the two of them could, within the limits any famous couple has to accept, behave like an ordinary couple getting to know each other. Charles wrote her letters when they were apart, in the same earnest, slightly formal register that people who received his correspondence throughout his life have consistently described, and the two of them spoke by telephone often enough that Sarah later characterized the relationship, when asked, as a close and genuine friendship, rather than a grand romance, a distinction she seems to have understood clearly from fairly early on, and that the press, invested in a much more dramatic story, simply declined to print. The three houses that structured this courtship, Sandringham in Norfolk, Balmoral in the Scottish Highlands, and Windsor Castle west of London, each served the royal calendar differently, and knowing which house a courtship was unfolding in tells you something about how seriously it was being taken. Sandringham, used mainly over Christmas and into the New Year, functioned as familiar, relatively relaxed territory, given the Spencers' own history there as neighbours and tenants. Balmoral, reserved for late summer, was the more serious test, an extended stay of weeks rather than days, deep in the Highlands, where a guest could not simply leave for an evening if the company grew tiresome, and where the wider family had ample time to observe a prospective bride at close range across shooting, fishing, and long, unstructured evenings. Windsor, used for state occasions and formal weekends throughout the year, carried a different weight again, closer to London, closer to the machinery of official duty, a house where a guest was reminded constantly of the institutional rather than the personal side of what she was being considered for. Sarah, over the course of her relationship with Charles, was received at all three, a level of access that itself signaled how seriously the family was weighing her as a candidate, regardless of what the newspapers could actually see or photograph. The moment that fixed her most firmly in the public imagination, as Charles's likely bride, came in February of 1978, when the two of them went skiing together at Klosters, the Swiss resort that had already become something of a royal tradition, and would remain one for the family for decades afterward. Photographers caught them together on the slopes, relaxed, laughing, dressed in the sort of matching ski gear that made for an easy front page. It is worth being precise about what that trip actually was. A week of skiing among friends, nothing more formal than that, and by Sarah's own later account, not the turning point in her feelings that the press assumed it to be. But to a press corps and a public starved for confirmation that the royal family's long search for a bride was finally over, it read as exactly that, and the coverage in the weeks that followed treated the engagement as close to a formality. Klosters itself deserves a word of explanation, because the choice of location was not incidental. The resort had become a fixture for wealthy and titled British families through the 1960s and 70s, precisely because it offered something increasingly hard to find elsewhere in Europe: genuine seclusion from the kind of crowds that had begun overrunning more famous alpine resorts, reachable by a narrow valley road that made it comparatively easy to control who came and went. That seclusion, of course, only ever worked against ordinary tourists, against a press corps willing to charter helicopters and station photographers with long lenses on the surrounding ridgelines for days at a time. Klosters offered no real protection at all, and the images that came back from Sarah and Charles's 1978 trip were reproduced across front pages, not just in Britain, but internationally, syndicated to newspapers as far away as Australia and the United States, a scale of exposure that gives some sense of just how enormous the appetite for this story had become, barely a year after Sarah and Charles were first linked in the press. Charles had, in fact, spoken publicly about exactly this calculation years before Sarah ever entered his life. In a candid television interview, given not long after his investiture, in which he described marriage for a man in his position as a much more calculated business than simply falling in love, remarking that whoever he married would, in effect, be marrying the whole country and the institution along with him, and that he intended to take considerably longer than most people to find someone capable of surviving that arrangement. It was an unusually honest thing for a 21-year-old heir to the throne to say on camera, and it went almost entirely unremarked upon at the time, filed away as a minor curiosity rather than read, as it deserves to be read in hindsight, as Charles telling the public plainly, years in advance, exactly the terms on which he would eventually choose, and eventually fail to choose well by, both Sarah and Diana in turn. Charles kept returning to Klosters for decades after his relationship with Sarah ended, a habit that eventually produced tragedy of a very different kind. In March of 1988, while skiing off-piste there with a group of friends, an avalanche struck the party, killing Major Hugh Lindsay, a former royal equerry and close friend of Charles's, and seriously injuring another member of the group, Charles's future sister-in-law, Sarah Ferguson's own circle, intersecting with his in the chaos of the moment. Charles himself was unhurt, but was reportedly deeply shaken, having been skiing only a short distance from where Lindsay was buried in the snow, and he gave a brief, visibly distressed television statement in the immediate aftermath, one of the rawer, less controlled public moments of his entire adult life. The resort that had once symbolized the giddy early publicity of his courtship with Sarah became, a decade later, the site of one of the genuine personal tragedies of his life, a reminder that the same mountains photographed so cheerfully in 1978 carried real danger underneath the glamour the press had always been more interested in selling. Lindsay himself deserves to be named properly here, rather than treated only as a footnote to Charles's own distress. He had served as an equerry to the Queen earlier in his career, part of the same tradition of trusted royal service that Johnny Spencer had belonged to a generation earlier, and he left behind a wife, Sarah Lindsay, who had been married to him for less than a year. The Princess Royal, Anne, a close friend of the Lindsays, attended the funeral alongside Charles, and the tragedy briefly reoriented the tone of royal press coverage away from the usual diet of courtships and speculation, towards something considerably more sober, a reminder, arriving in the middle of a decade, largely defined by exactly the kind of frivolous royal romance coverage this account has spent so long describing, that real people with real families stood immediately adjacent to every part of this story. Not only the princes and their brides, but the equerries, the friends, and the staff who made the whole apparatus function, and who occasionally, as Lindsay did, paid for their proximity to it with their lives. Despite that tragedy, the family's attachment to Klosters outlasted Charles's own generation. William took his own young family, skiing there in later years, continuing an association between the Spencer and Windsor circles and that particular valley that now stretches back, by the time of this recording, nearly half a century, from a 29-year-old prince and a 22-year-old presumptive bride, photographed together on a sunny slope in 1978, through tragedy in 1988, to a new generation of royal children learning to ski on the same mountainside their great-uncle once photographed, with an entirely different, entirely hopeful set of headlines attached to it. It was in the middle of that wave of speculation, with newspapers essentially writing her wedding announcement for her before she had agreed to any such thing, that Sarah Spencer did something that no woman in her position had done before her, and that very few have done since. She spoke to a reporter, and she told the truth. The interview has been quoted so many times, in so many slightly different versions, that it is worth saying plainly that the exact wording has blurred at the edges over 5 decades of retelling. But the substance of what Sarah Spencer said, to a journalist who asked her directly whether she intended to marry the Prince of Wales, has never been in dispute, because she never once tried to walk it back. She said she was not in love with Charles. She said she would not marry any man she did not love, whether he was a duke or, in the phrasing that stuck and has followed her ever since, a dustman, and that if he asked her, she would turn him down. She added, in the same conversation, that she thought she and Charles would probably end up as good friends and nothing more. The reaction from the rest of Fleet Street was immediate and, in its own way, revealing of exactly how unprepared the press was for a source who simply told them what they had asked to know. Rival papers spent the following days running follow-up pieces trying to pass whether Sarah's comments represented a genuine rejection of Charles, or merely, as some coverage speculated, a calculated show of modesty designed to make her seem less presumptuous. A reading that says considerably more about how thoroughly the press had convinced itself that no woman in her position could possibly mean what she said than it does about Sarah herself. Commentators debated whether she had embarrassed the prince, whether the palace would be furious, whether the relationship could possibly survive a public statement that direct. Some columnists praised her candor as refreshing. Others treated it as a minor scandal in its own right, evidence of a young woman who did not understand, or did not care, how the game was supposed to be played. What almost none of the coverage did, in the moment, was take her entirely at her word, which is its own small irony, given that the substance of what she said turned out, in the fullness of time, to be exactly true. Buckingham Palace, true to the institution's oldest instinct, said nothing at all in response, offering no comment when reporters called seeking a palace reaction, a silence that newspapers themselves treated as its own kind of confirmation that something had genuinely been disrupted behind the scenes. That non-response was itself a small, telling data point about how the institution handled moments like this one. Never confirming, never denying, simply waiting for a story to lose momentum on its own, rather than engaging with it directly. The same strategy that would fail catastrophically 2 decades later, when Diana's own revelations proved considerably harder to simply wait out. Sit with how unusual that is, in the context of everything else you have just read about how the other women in his orbit were expected to behave. Every other name on that list, Georgiana Russell, Davina Sheffield, the ones who came before her and the ones who came after, played the game the way the institution needed it played, saying nothing, giving nothing away, letting the speculation build or collapse on its own, without ever confirming or denying it themselves. Sarah broke that rule in public, on the record, at the exact moment the press had decided her wedding was already a foregone conclusion. She did not do it to embarrass him. By every account of her personality that survives from this period, she did it because someone asked her a direct question, and she gave a direct answer. A habit that had apparently served her well through every crisis her own family had already handed her, and that she was not about to abandon just because the man asking indirectly happened to be next in line for the throne. It is worth pausing on that habit specifically, since it is the thread running underneath nearly every decision this account has attributed to Sarah across her entire life, before, during, and after her relationship with Charles. She answered the question about the anorexia she had survived. She answered the question about whether she loved a prince. She answered, decades later, by her continued silence, every implicit question about whether she wanted to profit from her own small piece of this story. And each of those answers, taken together, describes a person operating from a single, consistent principle, rather than a series of disconnected choices, that a direct question deserves a direct answer, regardless of who is asking it, or what it might cost to give one. The palace's response to this kind of directness, historically, was not gratitude. An institution that had spent generations perfecting the art of saying nothing definite about anything did not reward a young woman for saying something definite about everything. Whether that interview alone ended the relationship, or whether it was simply the clearest public marker of a courtship that was already losing momentum for reasons neither of them ever spelled out in detail, the timeline afterward tells its own story. The sightings grew less frequent through the summer and autumn of 1978. The newspapers, who had spent a year and a half building Sarah Spencer into the presumptive Princess of Wales, quietly moved on to searching for her replacement, the same restless, faintly cruel process that had already claimed several women before her, and would go on claiming them for 2 more years, until it finally landed, with consequences nobody could have predicted, on her own younger sister. But that ending had not happened yet, not in November of 1977, when Sarah invited Charles to Althorp for a weekend's shooting, and brought her family's other children along the way families do, without a second thought about who might be standing in a muddy field when a future king came to visit. Althorp in 1977 was still a fairly new home for the family. Sarah's father had only inherited the earldom and the house 2 years earlier, in 1975, on the death of his own father, and the move from Park House on the Sandringham estate to this much grander, much older seat in Northamptonshire had reshuffled the whole family's daily life. Diana, at 16, was splitting her time between school and the new house, not yet the polished figure the world would later recognize, but a schoolgirl with a reputation among people who knew her then for being kind, a little shy in large groups, and devoted to small children, a trait that would later define her first job, working at a kindergarten in London. The contrast between the two sisters, even at this early stage, is worth drawing out plainly, because it explains a great deal about why the same family produced 2 such differently equipped young women within a span of only 6 years. Sarah, by every surviving description, was the extroverted one, the rider, the arguer, the sister who filled a room and did not shrink from confrontation. Diana was the quieter one, more comfortable one-on-one than in a crowd, drawn instinctively toward people who needed looking after, rather than toward the center of attention. A temperament that made her, by all accounts, genuinely gifted at the kindergarten work she eventually took up, and genuinely beloved by the small children in her care. but that also left her considerably less equipped than her older sister to hold her ground against an institution that specialized in making people feel small. Where Sarah met scrutiny with bluntness, Diana, at least in these early years, met it with a kind of anxious eagerness to please that people who knew her have described consistently since, a wish to be liked and approved of that made her, without anyone necessarily intending it, the far easier candidate for an institution looking for a bride who would not ask too many difficult questions before saying yes. It helps to understand what a shoot like the one at Althorp actually involved, because the word conjures something considerably more casual than the reality. A driven pheasant shoot, the dominant form of the sport among English landowning families by this period, required weeks of preparation, gamekeepers rearing and releasing birds, specifically to be driven over the guns later in the season. Beaters, often local estate workers or hired hands, walking in a coordinated line through woodland and hedgerow to flush birds into flight toward a row of standing guns positioned at intervals across a field, each gun typically assisted by a loader who handled the reloading of a second weapon so the shooting could continue without pause. It was, in other words, a highly organized, labor-intensive social ritual, one that brought together the family hosting it, their invited guests, and a considerable support staff of employees, all coordinated around the specific goal of giving guests like Charles a full day of shooting broken by an elaborate lunch, itself a significant piece of the social choreography, at which the day's events, and the guests themselves, could be properly discussed and assessed. Sarah, as the daughter of the house, would have had a direct hand in managing at least some part of that coordination, another quiet demonstration of the competence the system had spent her whole childhood training her toward. November in Northamptonshire brings short days and long shadows, the kind of low grey light that photographers of the period consistently struggled with, and that gives period photographs of these weekends their distinctive flat, overcast quality, guns and dogs and tweed rendered in a palette of browns and greens, under a sky that rarely offered anything as dramatic as sunshine. It was not glamorous weather, and it was not meant to be. The entire ritual prized function over spectacle, warm layers over fashion, competence with a gun over performance for an audience, values that suited Sarah's own temperament considerably better than the more theatrical demands of a formal London evening ever did. One more small piece of evidence for why the countryside, rather than the palace, was always the more natural habitat for the woman at the centre of this account. The shoot that weekend was, by the standards of that world, an ordinary one. Guns walking hedgerows and stubble fields around no-bottle wood on the estate, beaters flushing pheasant from cover, a lunch laid out somewhere with the kind of unhurried formality that country house weekends of that era specialized in. Charles came as Sarah's guest, which meant he came expecting a shooting weekend and a chance to see the woman he was, by every outward sign, seriously courting. What he got, in addition to that, was an introduction to her family, including a teenage sister who had wandered out to watch, or to walk a dog, or simply because it was her own house and there was nothing else to do on a Saturday in the country. The two of them spoke, briefly, in the way people speak when one of them is a famous stranger and the other is a bored 16-year-old with nothing invested in impressing him. He later described her as jolly, amusing, and full of fun. She, by all evidence that survives, did not think much of the encounter at all, because there was nothing yet to think. She was being introduced to her older sister's boyfriend, not to a future husband, a category of person teenagers generally regard with mild curiosity and no particular reverence. Sarah was there too, of course, hosting the weekend, managing the logistics that fall to the daughter of the house when a prince comes to shoot, and if she noticed the brief exchange between Charles and her little sister at all, nothing about it registered as significant enough for anyone to record. Why would it have? Sarah was, at that point, roughly a year into a courtship that newspapers across the country believed was heading toward a royal wedding. She had no reason to see her 16-year-old sister as anything other than exactly what she was, a schoolgirl underfoot on a family weekend. The idea that the man standing next to her would, within 3 years, be engaged to that same schoolgirl was not a plot twist anyone at Althorp that weekend could have predicted, least of all Sarah, who was still, at that point, very much the woman Charles was choosing to spend his weekends with. That is the detail nearly every retrospective account of this story gets wrong, or at least gets out of order. The sister did not size up her 16-year-old rival across a muddy field. There was no rival yet. There was a courtship that still had the better part of a year left to run, an interview that had not yet happened, and a younger sister who would not re-enter Charles's life in any romantic sense for another 3 years, by which point Sarah's own relationship with him had ended so completely, and so long before, that when Charles and Diana's romance finally began in the summer of 1980, Sarah's connection to it was almost incidental. She was the sister of the bride, not a discarded predecessor haunting the wedding photographs. The gap between those two versions of the story, the myth of the jealous older sister, and the far less dramatic reality of a courtship that had simply run its course years earlier, tells you something important about how these stories get simplified in the retelling, and about how much more interesting the true version usually is than the one that survives in shorthand. It helps, at this point, to widen the frame and look at what Charles's search for a wife actually looked like across the whole of the 1970s, because Sarah Spencer was neither the first nor the last woman to be run through what amounted to the same process, and the pattern is more instructive than any single relationship in isolation. The requirements the palace and the press quietly imposed on a future Princess of Wales were, by the standards of any other marriage on earth, bizarre. She needed to come from the right kind of family, aristocratic but not too grand, English but not too political. She needed, by an unwritten and deeply old-fashioned standard that nobody in authority would admit to enforcing, but that every gossip columnist understood perfectly, to have no serious romantic history of her own, an expectation applied to the women in Charles's life with a rigor nobody thought to apply to Charles. And she needed to be willing to disappear, almost entirely, into a role that offered enormous privilege and almost no personal autonomy, trading a private life for a public one on terms she would not get to negotiate. Some of those requirements were not actually unwritten at all, and it is worth being precise about the ones that had genuine legal force, because they narrowed the field even further than gossip and snobbery alone could manage. Under the Act of Settlement of 1701, still in force throughout this entire period, any member of the royal family who married a Roman Catholic was automatically removed from the line of succession, a rule dating back to England's religious conflicts centuries earlier that had nothing whatsoever to do with Charles's own generation, but that still quietly eliminated a meaningful share of Europe's Catholic aristocracy as potential brides for him. As the future head of the Church of England, Charles's own wife was expected, as a practical if not always explicitly stated matter, to be a communicant member of that church as well, which further narrowed a pool that had already been narrowed by class, by nationality, and by the unwritten expectation of a clean romantic history. It would take until 2013, with the passage of the Succession to the Crown Act, for Parliament to finally remove the bar on marrying a Catholic, a reform that arrived roughly a decade too late to have made the slightest difference to Sarah Spencer, to Diana, or to any of the other women whose candidacies were shaped by rules considerably older than the men enforcing them. Camilla Shand had failed that test in the early 1970s for reasons that had far more to do with timing and family disapproval than with anything wrong with her, and by the time Charles was courting Sarah, Camilla had already married Andrew Parker Bowles and settled into the kind of adjacent, unresolved presence in Charles's life that would, decades later, outlast 2 other marriages and reshape the entire monarchy. Davina Sheffield had been effectively destroyed by newspaper reporting that dug into her private life with a viciousness that reads as shocking even by the standards of 1970s Fleet Street. And after Sarah, the search moved on to a woman named Anna Wallis, the daughter of a Scottish landowner, whose relationship with Charles lasted through 1979 and into 1980, and who is remembered, in the small handful of retrospectives that bother to mention her at all, for ending things after a public evening at which Charles spent the night dancing with Camilla Parker Bowles and largely ignoring her. Wallis was reportedly furious, told people close to her that she would not be made a fool of in public, and ended the relationship on her own terms shortly afterward. Another woman who looked closely at what Charles's attention actually cost and decided against paying the price. The specific evening that ended things between Charles and Wallis has become one of the more frequently retold episodes from this period, partly because it captures the pattern this account keeps returning to in miniature. At a dance held for Princess Anne's household staff, Charles reportedly spent much of the night on the floor with Camilla Parker Bowles, while Wallace, his actual date for the evening, stood largely ignored at the edge of the room, a piece of public humiliation dressed up as an ordinary country dance. Wallace, unlike several of the women who came before her, was known among friends for a sharp tongue and an even sharper sense of her own worth, rather than any inclination to absorb that kind of slight quietly, and she reportedly told Charles afterward, in language considerably less measured than anything Sarah Spencer ever gave a newspaper, that she had no intention of being made a fool of in front of people she knew. The relationship ended within weeks. Wallace went on to marry an old Etonian landowner a few years later, and like Sarah, largely withdrew from public life, declining for decades afterward to give the kind of paid interview that would have been easy money for a woman who had once dated a future king. Between the two of them, Sarah and Anna Wallace represent the two most direct precedents for what would later, and far more consequentially, happen to Diana. Women who watched Camilla's continued presence in Charles's life up close, recognized what it meant, and left before that recognition could cost them anything more than a headline. Within the narrow social world both women moved through, the reaction to Sarah's decision was, by several later accounts, considerably more approving than the newspaper's breathless coverage might suggest. The English aristocracy of this period held a genuine, if rarely stated aloud, respect for exactly the kind of self-possession Sarah had displayed. An old-fashioned value system, in which knowing your own mind and refusing to be pushed around, even by royalty, counted for something among people whose own families had spent centuries jealously guarding their independence from the crown, even while socializing closely with it. Sarah's own social standing, among the families she actually saw at weekends and dinners for the rest of her life, does not appear to have suffered in any meaningful way for having turned down a prince. If anything, several of the biographers who touch on this period suggest it enhanced her reputation within that world as a woman who could not be bought, which is a considerably different verdict than the one the tabloid coverage of the moment implied, and a useful reminder that Fleet Street's version of a story, and the version believed by the people who actually knew the participants, were not always the same story at all. Set Sarah's story next to Anna Wallace's and next to Camilla's unfinished business, and a shape starts to emerge that has nothing to do with any individual failing on Charles's part, and everything to do with a structural problem the institution never solved. Charles, by nearly every account written about him during this period, wanted a wife who understood him, who could hold her own against the strange gravitational pull of his position, and who would not simply defer to him out of awe. And yet the same institution that produced that preference in him also made it almost impossible for any woman who actually met it to survive the process of courting him, because a woman confident enough to speak her mind, as Sarah did to that reporter, or a woman with enough self-respect to walk away from public humiliation, as Anna Wallace did, was also, by definition, a woman unwilling to accept the terms the position ultimately demanded. The women who eventually did accept those terms tended to be considerably younger, considerably less experienced, and considerably less equipped to say no. Diana was 19 when her engagement was announced. She had never had what would be called, even generously, a serious relationship. She had spent her adult life, such as it was at that age, working with small children and living quietly with flatmates, about as far from the assertive, well-traveled, already tested women who preceded her as it was possible to be. None of this means Sarah Spencer somehow foresaw her sister's marriage or tried to prevent it. There is no evidence she did either, but the contrast between the woman who nearly became Princess of Wales in 1977 and the one who actually did, in 1981, runs deeper than coincidence or dramatic irony. It reads as a pattern the institution kept producing whether anyone intended it or not, favoring, again and again, exactly the kind of bride least equipped to survive what the role required, while the women capable of surviving it kept declining to apply. Sarah did not spend long in the wilderness after her relationship with Charles ended. Within 2 years she had met and fallen for Neil McCorquodale, a former Grenadier Guards officer turned Lincolnshire farmer, and the two of them married in 1980 at the Spencer family's parish church near Althorp, a considerably quieter wedding than the one her sister would have the following year, and by most accounts, a considerably happier one for the bride. They went on to have 3 children together and settled into the kind of rural, largely private life that Sarah had, in her own words to that reporter 3 years earlier, said she actually wanted. She got, in other words, almost exactly what she told the newspapers she was holding out for, a marriage built on affection rather than obligation, to a man who was not required to be watched by the entire country every time he left the house. It is worth being specific about who Neil McCorquodale actually was, because the contrast between the marriage Sarah chose and the one her sister was about to enter is instructive in its own right. The McCorquodale family had made its money in printing, running one of Britain's larger commercial printing businesses across several generations, which meant Neil came from real wealth, but from a background with no formal rank attached to it, no title, no ancient house, nothing that would have registered on the same social radar as a Spencer or a royal in waiting. He had served as an officer in the Grenadier Guards, one of the regiments that has long supplied a steady stream of husbands to daughters of the English aristocracy, and by the time he met Sarah, he had moved into farming, taking on land in Lincolnshire that had nothing romantic about it, beyond the fact that it was entirely his own to manage, answerable to no institution larger than a bank and a planning office. Sarah, in other words, did not simply choose a quieter life in the abstract. She chose a specific man whose entire existence sat outside the machinery that had spent a year and a half photographing her, a man whose business was crops and livestock rather than public duty, and whose family, however comfortable, had no interest in being written about by anyone. That choice looks even more deliberate set against the mechanics of how marriages like the one her sister was about to make actually got arranged in this world. For centuries, the English aristocracy had managed its own marriage market through an overlapping set of institutions, family friendships stretching back generations, shared attendance at the same handful of boarding schools, and a shared social calendar built around specific fixed points: the racing at Ascot in June, the regatta at Henley, the shooting season beginning in August, the hunting season through the winter, each one an occasion at which families who already knew each other could bring their grown children together, under conditions that felt like leisure but functioned, whether anyone said so out loud or not, as vetting. A young woman's suitability was assessed not through anything so crude as an interview, but through a season or two of exactly this kind of exposure, watched by the older generation for signs of poise, of appropriate behavior, of a temperament that would wear well over decades of public scrutiny. Sarah had been run through this system once already, at the very top of it, with the highest possible stakes attached, and having survived it, she used the freedom that came with having already been tested to opt out of the version that would have kept those stakes permanently in place. Marrying Neil McCorquodale did not mean marrying beneath her family's standing. It meant marrying entirely outside the specific, narrow track that standing had been quietly steering her along since childhood. Life on a working Lincolnshire farm bore almost no resemblance to the world Sarah had briefly glimpsed as Charles's likely bride, and that contrast seems to have been very much the point, rather than an unfortunate side effect. Farming in that part of England in the 1980s meant real, physically demanding, economically uncertain work, dependent on weather, on crop prices, on the ordinary financial pressures that affect any agricultural business, regardless of how many centuries a family name stretches back. Neil McCorquodale ran his land the way any serious farmer of the period did, and Sarah, by every account of her life after 1980, threw herself into that world with the same directness she had once used on a reporter, raising her children, managing a large rural household, and involving herself in the unglamorous, deeply local rhythms of Lincolnshire country life, school runs and church fetes, and agricultural shows, rather than state banquets and television audiences numbering in the hundreds of millions. It was a smaller life, in the most literal sense, than the one the newspapers had spent a year and a half predicting for her, and by every indication available since, it was also a considerably happier one. One of Sarah's 3 children, her daughter Emily, would later step briefly into the public eye herself as a fashion model in the early 2000s, an interesting small echo of the world her mother had once been offered a much larger version of, and had turned down, though Emily's own experience of that spotlight, chosen on her own terms as an adult rather than assigned to her at 19 by a national newspaper, bore almost no resemblance to what either Sarah or Diana had lived through a generation earlier. That same year, 1980, was the year Charles's attention finally turned toward Diana in earnest. The two of them had crossed paths occasionally in the years since that shooting weekend at Althorp, as members of overlapping social circles inevitably do, but the relationship that would end in an engagement began properly in July, at a country weekend where Diana was watching Charles play polo, and it developed quickly over the following months, through visits to Balmoral, the royal family's Scottish estate, that had long functioned as an informal testing ground for potential brides. Since a candidate's ability to tolerate long, unglamorous days of hiking, fishing, and formal evening dress in a remote and often cold corner of the Highlands was treated by the wider family as a genuine indicator of whether she could tolerate royal life more broadly, and a level of press interest that made the coverage Sarah had endured 3 years earlier look almost restrained by comparison. Diana was 19. She was working at a kindergarten in Pimlico, living with flatmates, and within a matter of weeks found her home and workplace surrounded by photographers, in numbers that had not been seen around any of Charles's previous girlfriends, Sarah included. The engagement was announced in February of 1981, sealed with a 12-carat oval blue sapphire, surrounded by 14 diamonds, a ring Diana was allowed to choose herself from a jeweler's tray, rather than have selected for her. A small gesture of personal choice, inside an arrangement that otherwise offered her very little. That same ring would outlive the marriage that created it by decades, passed down after Diana's death to her son William, who gave it to Kate Middleton when he proposed in 2010, a piece of jewelry that has now sat on the hand of two very different royal brides. One whose marriage ended in divorce and tragedy, the other married for well over a decade with none of the same public turmoil, a small, durable object carrying the entire arc of this family's complicated luck across 2 generations on a single finger. The engagement was marked, as royal engagements by then had come to be, with an official photo call on the grounds of Buckingham Palace and a joint television interview, a formal ritual that Sarah's own courtship never advanced far enough to require. It was during that engagement interview that a reporter asked the couple whether they were in love, and Diana, 19 years old, and clearly delighted, answered immediately, "Of course," while Charles, standing beside her, added the 4 words that have followed him ever since. Whatever in love means. A strange, hedging addition that unsettled Diana badly enough that she mentioned it, confused and hurt, to friends afterward, though she said nothing about it publicly until years later. That single moment, replayed countless times in the decades since, as shorthand for everything that would eventually go wrong in the marriage, reads very differently once set against Charles's own 1969 remarks about marrying the whole institution rather than simply a person. He had told the country, 12 years earlier, exactly how he intended to approach this decision: calculation over feeling, suitability over romance. And when a reporter finally asked him directly, on the day his engagement was announced, whether love was actually part of the equation, he answered with what was, by his own long-stated standard, simple honesty, rather than the callousness the moment is usually remembered for. Diana had not seen that earlier interview, or had not absorbed its implications the way an older, more experienced woman like Sarah might have. And the gap between what Charles had been telling the public about himself for over a decade, and what a 19-year-old bride actually understood about the man she was marrying, may be the single clearest measure, in this entire account, of exactly how much warning separated the 2 Spencer sisters who each, in their own way, ended up defining the answer to his question. The wedding followed that July, at St. Paul's Cathedral, in front of a global television audience estimated at several 100 million people, a scale of spectacle that made Sarah's own brief turn as the nation's most watched almost bride look like a rehearsal for the real production. A few details from that wedding are worth setting down plainly, because they capture just how enormous the gap had grown between the scale of scrutiny Sarah experienced in 1977 and what Diana was walking into only 4 years later. St. Paul's Cathedral was chosen over the more traditional Westminster Abbey, specifically because its longer nave allowed for a grander procession and a larger congregation, a decision made with the television audience as much in mind as the guests actually present. Diana's dress, designed by David and Elizabeth Emanuel, carried a 25-foot train, the longest in royal wedding history at that point, made from ivory silk taffeta and antique lace, and required such careful handling that Diana practiced walking in it for weeks beforehand. The tiara she wore that day was not a royal piece at all, but the Spencer tiara, commissioned in the 1800s and added to by successive generations, a family heirloom that had already passed through several generations of Spencer brides before her, including, briefly, Sarah herself, who had borrowed it for her own wedding to Neil McCorquodale the year before. A small, easily overlooked detail that means the same piece of family jewelry sat on both sisters' heads within 12 months of each other. Worn first for a quiet countryside wedding almost nobody outside the family paid attention to, and then for a ceremony watched by most of the population of the earth. During the ceremony itself, in front of that global audience, Diana famously transposed the order of Charles's own names, saying Philip Charles Arthur George instead of Charles Philip Arthur George, a small human slip that newspapers seized on almost immediately as an odd, unintentionally telling moment in an otherwise flawlessly stage-managed event. The image that closed the day, the two of them kissing on the Buckingham Palace balcony in front of a crowd estimated at over 600,000 people lining the processional route alone, became one of the most reproduced photographs of the 20th century, an image of uncomplicated joy that stood, within little more than a decade, in almost total contradiction to everything that would later come out about the marriage behind it. Where Sarah fit into all of this, once her own sister became the central character in the story she had already lived a smaller version of, is a question the tabloid coverage of the time never seriously asked, mostly because the simpler, more dramatic version, Sister Loses Prince, Sister's Sister Wins Prince, made for a better headline than the far more mundane truth. The truth is that by 1981, Sarah was a married woman with a young family of her own, 3 years removed from a courtship she had ended on her own terms, and by every account that exists of the two sisters' relationship, she supported Diana rather than resenting her. Diana, for her part, appears to have leaned on her older sister as one of the few people in her life who understood, from direct personal experience, exactly what she was walking into. Sarah had lived through the version of that scrutiny that ended before the wedding. Diana was about to live through the version that did not end for 16 years and ended, in the end, in a Paris underpass rather than in a quiet divorce. It is worth stating plainly what actually happened in that underpass, because the same press machinery that this account has traced from Sarah Spencer's ski trip at Klosters through Davina Sheffield's ordeal and onward never really eased its grip on the family, and its final, fatal escalation deserves to be named rather than gestured at. On the 31st of August 1997, Diana was killed in a car crash in the Pont de l'Alma tunnel in Paris, traveling with her companion Dodi Fayed and driven by a chauffeur, Henri Paul, who was later found by a lengthy British inquest to have been over the legal alcohol limit and driving at grossly excessive speed while attempting to outrun a group of pursuing photographers on motorcycles. The inquest, which concluded in 2008 after years of investigation, formally ruled the deaths of Diana and Dodi Fayed unlawful killings caused by the grossly negligent driving of the following vehicles and of Paul himself. Several photographers were arrested at the scene and investigated, though none were ultimately convicted of any offense directly tied to the crash itself. The public reaction, in the days that followed, turned briefly and furiously against the entire industry that had spent 2 decades treating Diana, and Sarah before her, and every other woman drawn into Charles's orbit, as raw material for a story that never stopped being profitable. That reaction produced real, if incomplete, institutional change. The Press Complaints Commission, the industry's self-regulatory body at the time, tightened its guidelines on photographing public figures, particularly around the harassment implied by high-speed pursuit in the immediate aftermath of Diana's death. A far larger reckoning came over a decade later, when revelations that several British tabloids had been illegally hacking the voicemails of public figures and ordinary crime victims alike triggered the Leveson Inquiry in 2011 and 2012, a sweeping public investigation into press ethics and regulation that led directly to the closure of the News of the World, one of the very papers that had helped drive the royal courtship coverage of Sarah Spencer's era decades earlier. None of it, of course, could undo what had already happened by the time any of these reforms arrived. But it is difficult to trace the full arc of this story, from a shooting weekend at Althorp in 1977 to a tunnel in Paris 20 years later, without recognizing that the same commercial machinery this account described in Fleet Street's 1970s heyday never actually stopped operating on the same basic incentives until it had produced a death serious enough to force the issue. The marriage that followed the wedding has been documented at exhausting length elsewhere, and this is not the place to relitigate the affair with Camilla Parker Bowles, the separate households, the dueling interviews, or the divorce that was finalized in 1996. What matters for Sarah's part of this story is that she remained, throughout all of it, one of the steadier presences in Diana's life, a sister who had already seen the man at the center of the storm up close, without the fairy tale gloss the rest of the country had been sold, and who therefore had little reason to be shocked by anything that came out about him later. People close to the family have described Sarah as a stabilizing figure for Diana during the worst years of the marriage's collapse, someone she could speak to plainly, in the same blunt register Sarah had once used on a reporter who asked her whether she planned to marry a prince. One piece of that later record deserves particular attention here, because it confirms, in Charles's own words decades after the fact, exactly the dynamic Sarah Spencer appears to have intuited in 1977. In 1994, Charles cooperated with the broadcaster and writer Jonathan Dimbleby on an authorized biography, granting him access to his private letters and diaries in an attempt to shape his own public account of the collapsing marriage. What emerged instead was a portrait considerably more damaging than anything a hostile biographer could have produced. Charles told Dimbleby plainly that he had proposed to Diana only after sustained pressure from his family and from the press to finally settle the question of a bride, that he had gone into the marriage with serious private doubts about whether he actually loved her in the way a husband ought to, and that he had continued his relationship with Camilla Parker Bowles throughout the marriage's collapse. The book, intended to generate sympathy for a man widely seen as cold and unfaithful, instead handed the public confirmation, in his own authorized words, of precisely the institutional trap this account has spent so long describing: a prince who married the candidate the system had prepared for him, rather than the partner he actually wanted, because the system had spent 2 decades teaching him that those were never supposed to be the same choice. The Dimbleby biography also revealed the specific mechanism of that pressure in unusually concrete terms. Prince Philip, growing impatient in early 1981, with what he saw as his son's dithering over Diana, reportedly wrote Charles a letter urging him to make a decision one way or another, either propose or end the relationship cleanly, on the reasoning that continuing to see her without committing risked damaging her reputation, given how intensely the press was already covering them. Charles later told Dimbleby that he received this letter as an ultimatum rather than as the fatherly advice it may genuinely have been intended as, and that it played a direct role in accelerating his proposal beyond the pace he might otherwise have chosen for himself. Whether Philip meant it as pressure or as protection, the effect was the same either way: a father's intervention nudging a hesitant son toward a decision that would define, and eventually devastate, 4 other lives, Diana's own included, in ways no single letter could have anticipated at the time it was written. When Diana died in August of 1997, Sarah, along with her sister Jane and their brother Charles, the 9th Earl Spencer, took on the difficult, intensely public work of grieving a family member while the entire world grieved alongside them, and in some ways ahead of them. The Spencer siblings played visible roles in the funeral arrangements and the service itself, a final, involuntary round of the same scrutiny that had followed all 3 sisters at different points in their lives, and Sarah, by then in her early 40s with a family of her own, absorbed it the way she appears to have absorbed most things, without much public complaint, and without ever selling her version of events to the highest bidder, a restraint that stands out sharply against how much of the rest of that story was eventually sold, serialized, and dramatized by almost everyone else who had ever stood near it. Their brother Charles, the 9th Earl, took a considerably more public role in that grief than either of his sisters, delivering a eulogy at the funeral service in Westminster Abbey that was broadcast live and watched by an enormous global audience, a speech in which he pointedly criticized the press for its role in Diana's death, and, in a line widely interpreted at the time as a direct rebuke of the royal family itself, promised that his sister's blood relatives would ensure her sons were not simply immersed in duty and tradition, but were able to sing openly as she wanted, rather than be simply molded into being royal. It was an extraordinary moment of public tension between the Spencer family and the institution Diana had married into, delivered inside one of that institution's own most sacred buildings, and it stands in sharp contrast to Sarah's own consistent preference for staying almost entirely out of any public reckoning with what had happened. Charles Spencer's own life since then has been considerably more turbulent than his sister's, marked by 2 divorces and periods of open, well-covered conflict with parts of his own family over the management of Althorp and the memorial built there to Diana. A reminder that even within the same set of siblings, raised in the same house under the same pressures, people can end up handling public life in wildly different ways. Sarah's own studied quiet standing as only one of several possible responses her generation of Spencers found to the same inherited weight. There is a piece of this family's history that most retrospectives about Diana skip entirely, and it belongs here, because it shaped the household Sarah grew up finishing her own courtship inside of, and it explains a great deal about why all 3 Spencer sisters developed the particular combination of toughness and wariness toward outsiders that shows up again and again in accounts of their adult lives. In 1976, the year Sarah's relationship with Charles was becoming public, her father Johnny remarried. His new wife was Rain, Countess of Dartmouth, a formidable, socially ambitious woman who was, by every account from the children of that household, deeply unpopular with all 4 of Johnny's children from his first marriage. The tabloids nicknamed her Acid Rain, a pun that stuck for the rest of her life, and stories about the new stepmother's redecorating of Althorp, her sale of family heirlooms to fund it, and her icy management of the household became a recurring feature of gossip coverage throughout the late 1970s, running in parallel with the coverage of Sarah's courtship with Charles, and later Diana's own engagement. The animosity toward Rain hardened into something considerably more complicated in September of 1978, when Johnny Spencer suffered a massive cerebral hemorrhage that left him gravely ill and, by his doctor's own assessment, not expected to survive. Rain, by every account of that period, took direct and forceful control of his medical care, pushing for an experimental drug treatment that conventional specialists were reluctant to try, and Johnny's eventual recovery, against genuinely long odds, is credited by most biographers of the family, substantially, to her persistence during those months. The children, Sarah included, were largely kept at a distance during his hospitalization and recovery, a decision Rain defended as necessary to protect a fragile patient from strain, but that the children experienced as a further, deeply painful demonstration of how completely their stepmother had come to control access to their own father. It is a genuinely difficult episode to render fairly, since the same woman the family had already nicknamed for her coldness may well have saved her husband's life through exactly the kind of forceful, unsentimental decisiveness that made her so unpopular with his children in the first place. 2 truths sitting uncomfortably next to each other in a way that neither the tabloids of the time nor most retrospectives since have had much patience for holding at once. The most infamous story attached to Rain, whether or not it happened exactly as the tabloids told it, involves Diana and her siblings supposedly shoving their stepmother down a staircase at Althorp in a fit of teenage rebellion, a tale that has been repeated so often it has taken on the texture of established fact, even though it was, by most serious accounts, considerably embellished from a real, but much smaller altercation. What is not embellished is the depth of the children's resentment, which was public knowledge well before Diana ever met Charles, and which gives useful context for understanding why Sarah, in particular, developed such a low tolerance for pretense and such a direct manner of dealing with conflict. She had already spent years watching her father's second marriage reshape her childhood home around a woman none of the children had chosen, and she had already learned that dignified silence did not always protect you from being written about anyway, so she might as well say what she actually thought when a reporter finally asked. That household tension also explains something about why Sarah's willingness to speak bluntly to the press in 1977 reads less like an aberration and more like a pattern that had already been established inside her own family years earlier. This was not a woman raised in an atmosphere of careful, managed silence. This was a woman raised in a household that had already been publicly dissected once, during her parents' divorce. and was being publicly dissected again over her father's remarriage, before she ever became interesting to Fleet Street in her own right. By the time reporters started asking her about her feelings for the Prince of Wales, she had already had roughly a decade of practice watching her family's private business become public argument, and she appears to have decided somewhere along the way that the only real defense against that process was to control her own account of it, rather than let it be assembled entirely out of other people's guesses. The Rain story does not actually end where the tabloids of the 1970s left it, and the way it ends complicates the simple villain narrative considerably. Johnny Spencer died in 1992, and Rain, cut out of a great deal of the family's ongoing life afterward, went on to remarry a French count, and largely receded from the public eye herself. What almost nobody expected was that in the years before Diana's death, the two women found something like a genuine rapprochement. Diana reportedly came to see her former stepmother with more sympathy as an adult than she had been capable of as a resentful teenager, and by the time Diana died in 1997, Rain was, by several accounts, one of the more visibly and sincerely devastated mourners at the funeral. A detail that rarely makes it into the shorthand version of the Acid Rain story, but that says something true about how thoroughly the passage of time can rearrange even the bitterest family conflicts. Frances, for her part, did not find a comparable peace with her own daughter before the end. Diana's parents' generation carried into old age many of the same wounds that had shaped their children's adolescence, and Frances's relationship with Diana grew markedly more strained in the years surrounding Diana's own divorce, not less. Frances, who had by then converted to Roman Catholicism and grown increasingly conservative in her personal views, disapproved openly of some of the choices Diana made during and after the breakdown of her marriage, and the two women were reportedly estranged, or close to it, for a period before Diana's death, a rupture that Frances herself later said she deeply regretted and never fully had the chance to repair. Set that alongside Sarah's own steadier, more supportive relationship with Diana throughout the same period, and a quiet contrast emerges within the family itself, between a mother who had already lost custody once and found it difficult to reconnect fully even after regaining access, and an older sister who had lived through her own version of the exact pressure Diana was under and used that experience to stay close rather than to judge from a distance. Frances lived another 7 years after her daughter's death, returning increasingly to her adopted home in the west of Scotland and to the Catholic faith that had become central to her later life, and she died in 2004, having spent her final years largely out of the public eye. Her own complicated legacy, a mother remembered simultaneously as the woman who lost a bitter custody battle in 1969, and as the grandmother of the future king, rarely reconciled into a single coherent picture by the coverage that followed her death. Sarah attended her mother's funeral alongside her surviving siblings, one more entry in a family history that this account has shown, again and again, to be considerably more marked by loss, rupture, and quiet endurance than the glossy surface of Spencer wealth and royal proximity ever let on to the public watching from outside it. It is worth widening the lens even further here, because Sarah Spencer's courtship with Charles and her sister's marriage after it were not isolated events. They were the latest entries in a much longer, much stranger institutional habit that the British monarchy had been repeating, in one form or another, for most of the 20th century, the habit of putting a small number of women through an almost impossible audition for a role that offered enormous privilege and almost no protection, and then acting surprised when the arrangement produced tragedy. The shape of this particular story, one sister brought close to a powerful man and then set aside while a younger sister takes her place at the altar, is also considerably older than the House of Windsor, and it is worth reaching back nearly 5 centuries to see how familiar the outline already was, long before there was a Sarah or a Diana to fill it. In the 1520s, Mary Boleyn became the mistress of King Henry VIII, a relationship that lasted several years and that some historians believe produced at least one child, though the king never formally acknowledged paternity. Mary was, for a period, the Boleyn family's most valuable asset at court, the sister whose position closest to the king brought her father and her siblings favor, land, and titles. And then Henry's attention moved on, as royal attention in that period reliably did, and it moved specifically to Mary's own younger sister Anne, who refused to become merely another mistress, held out for marriage instead, and eventually became queen, a decision that ended, famously and brutally, with her execution within the Tower of London less than 3 years into the marriage. Nobody sensible would draw a direct equivalence between the Tudor court and Althorp in the 1970s, and this account is not a tempting one. The stakes were different in kind, not simply in degree, and nothing that happened to Sarah Spencer, or to Diana, carries the literal mortal danger that Anne Boleyn lived and died under. But the underlying mechanism, an older sister providing the introduction, however unintentional, to a powerful man, who then transfers his attention to a younger sister, who ends up paying a far steeper price for the position than the first sister ever did, is old enough and recurrent enough across English history that it starts to look less like coincidence and more like something closer to a structural feature of how power, proximity, and family ambition interact whenever a small number of women are placed near a single man who cannot be refused. Sarah was never asked to compete for a crown the way Anne Boleyn was, but she stood, unknowingly, at the start of a chain of events that would eventually put her own sister in a position not unlike the one Tudor courtiers would have recognized instantly, a young woman elevated by royal favor into a role that ultimately consumed her, watched the whole time by an older sister who had once stood exactly where the king's attention first landed and had already, wisely as it turned out, stepped out of its path. Go back 4 decades before Sarah Spencer ever met Charles, to 1936, and you find the starkest version of this more recent pattern, the one that very nearly ended the monarchy altogether. Edward VIII, Charles's own great-uncle, chose to abdicate the throne rather than give up Wallis Simpson, a twice-divorced American the establishment considered entirely unsuitable, and the resulting crisis reshaped the institution's understanding of what a royal marriage was allowed to be for a generation afterward. The lesson the palace took from that episode was not that the rules governing who a royal could marry were too rigid. It was that the rules needed to be enforced even more strictly, and enforced earlier, before feelings had a chance to develop into anything the family might have to accommodate. That lesson landed hardest on the next generation. Princess Margaret, the Queen's younger sister, fell in love in the early 1950s with Group Captain Peter Townsend, a decorated war hero who happened to be a divorced man, and the establishment, still shaken by the abdication less than 20 years earlier, made it unmistakably clear that a marriage between them would not be permitted without Margaret giving up her royal position and income entirely. She chose, in 1955, to end the relationship rather than force that confrontation, a decision she reportedly regretted for the rest of her life, and that left her, by the account of nearly everyone who wrote about her afterward, restless and unhappy in the marriage she eventually did make instead. Margaret's story runs almost exactly parallel to Sarah Spencer's 2 decades later, a woman who understood precisely what the institution was asking her to give up, and chose, in the end, not to give it, except that Margaret's choice cost her the man she actually loved, while Sarah's cost her nothing she seems to have particularly wanted to keep. By the time Charles was searching for a wife in the 1970s, the institution had refined this audition process into something quieter and less openly punitive than banning a marriage outright, but no less effective at narrowing the field down to almost nobody. A candidate needed the right pedigree, the absence of any prior serious relationship, and a willingness to accept a level of scrutiny that had, by this point, been intensified enormously by the growth of a much larger, much more aggressive tabloid press than the one that had covered Margaret's romance 20 years earlier. Sarah Spencer met most of those requirements and failed only the last one, the willingness part, and she failed it on purpose, out loud, to a reporter who was frankly astonished to get a straight answer. Line all of these women up together, Mary and Anne Boleyn, Georgiana Spencer, Wallis Simpson, Princess Margaret, and finally Sarah, and a genuinely striking pattern emerges, one this account has been assembling piece by piece rather than presenting all at once, because it is easy to overstate when compressed into a single paragraph, and considerably more convincing when built up slowly through 5 centuries of actual documented lives. In every generation, the institution at the center of English power has required its women to submit to a form of scrutiny and self-erasure that it never once required of its men in equal measure, and in every generation, At least one woman has looked clearly at what was being asked of her, and refused, at whatever cost that refusal carried in her own historical moment. From Anne Boleyn's fatal insistence on marriage rather than mistress status, to Margaret's quieter, sadder decision to give up the man she loved rather than the position she was born into, to Sarah Spencer's considerably lower stakes but no less clear-eyed decision to simply say no and mean it. Diana is the one exception in this specific lineage who did not get the chance to refuse anything, swept into the role too young and too unprepared to apply the same clarity, which may be the single most important thing this entire account has tried to establish, that the difference between Sarah's story and Diana's was never a difference in the two women's character, but a difference in how much warning and how much genuine freedom to choose otherwise each of them was actually given. What makes this pattern worth dwelling on, rather than treating Sarah's story as a charming historical footnote, is how directly it explains what happened to her sister only a few years later. Diana met every requirement Sarah had refused to fully accept. She was young enough that she had no prior relationship history for the papers to dig into. She was, by the testimony of nearly everyone who knew her before her engagement, eager to please, deferential to Charles and to his family, and entirely unprepared for what accepting the role would actually cost her, because nobody in a position to warn her, including, one has to assume, her own sister, had any real way to convey what that cost would feel like until she was already living inside it. The institution had not, in other words, learned anything from Sarah's honesty. It had simply moved on to a candidate less likely to offer any. There is a version of this account that could have stopped at that single observation, since it captures, in a single sentence, most of what makes Sarah Spencer's story worth telling at all. But a single sentence does not make a documentary, and the value of spending this much time on the surrounding history, the Spencer family across 3 centuries, the press machinery that turned a private courtship into a national spectacle, the institutional habits stretching back through Wallis Simpson and Princess Margaret, and even further, is that it lets that single observation land with the full weight of everything that produced it, rather than as an isolated, easily dismissed claim about one family's particular luck. Sarah Spencer's decision was the product of a specific upbringing, a specific temperament, and a specific, narrow window of historical timing, not luck, that let her see the trap clearly enough and early enough to step around it before it closed. Before going further into what happened to Sarah in the decades after her sister's wedding, and before this documentary is over, if you want to see more of this channel's coverage of the women who came close to marrying into the royal family, and the ones who actually did, the subscribe button is right there, and turning on notifications means you will not miss the next one. Thank you for staying with this story this far. There is a lot still ahead, starting with the relationship that outlasted every single woman mentioned so far, including, eventually, Diana herself. That relationship was Camilla's, and it deserves more attention here than a passing mention, because it is the single thread connecting nearly every part of this story: Sarah's courtship, Diana's marriage, and the eventual shape of the modern monarchy. Camilla Shand met Charles in the early 1970s, and by most accounts the two of them fell for each other quickly and seriously, only for the relationship to be derailed by a combination of bad timing, family disapproval of Camilla as a suitable royal bride, and Charles's own naval deployment, which kept him away for a crucial stretch during which Camilla, apparently convinced the relationship had no future, accepted a proposal from Andrew Parker Bowles, an army officer she had dated on and off for years, and who had, by some accounts, once been romantically linked to Princess Anne. Camilla and Andrew married in 1973. Charles was reportedly devastated, and the timing means that by the time Sarah Spencer entered his life 3 years later, Camilla was already a married woman, already a fixture at many of the same social events Charles attended, and already, according to nearly every biography written about this period, someone he had never fully stopped confiding in. Camilla's own family background is worth a brief note here, since it sits at an interesting angle to everything this account has established about the Spencers. The Shands were landed gentry, rather than titled aristocracy, comfortable and well-connected, but a rung below the Spencer earldom on the strict hierarchy that governed exactly this kind of assessment, and Camilla's own great-grandmother, Alice Keppel, had been the long-acknowledged mistress of King Edward VII at the start of the 20th century. a relationship conducted with the same kind of open, tolerated discretion that would later characterize Camilla's own long entanglement with Charles, a family pattern separated by 3 generations, but strikingly, almost eerily consistent in its shape. Whether that history made the family more comfortable than most with the specific arrangement Camilla eventually settled into with Charles, a prince's committed but unofficial companion for decades before finally becoming his wife, is the kind of speculation this account generally avoids, but the parallel is documented, well known within royal history circles, and too resonant with everything else in this story to leave out entirely. This is the detail that gives Sarah's story its sharpest edge, and it is worth being direct about it, rather than dancing around it the way gentler retrospectives tend to. Camilla Parker Bowles was present, in some form, throughout Sarah's courtship with Charles. She was present throughout Anna Wallace's relationship with him after that, present in a way significant enough that Wallace's own frustration with the arrangement is one of the better documented reasons her relationship with Charles ended. And she was present, though far less visibly at first, throughout the early years of Charles's marriage to Diana as well, a fact that became public knowledge only gradually, and that eventually consumed the marriage entirely, culminating in Charles's own televised admission, in 1994, that he had returned to the relationship with Camilla after his marriage had, in his own words, irretrievably broken down. The engagement interview Charles and Diana gave together in 1981 already contained, in retrospect, nearly everything that would eventually go wrong. Asked by a reporter whether the two of them were in love, Diana answered immediately and simply, "Of course." Charles, standing beside her, added, "Whatever in love means," a hedge so strange and so widely noted at the time that it has followed him ever since as a kind of shorthand for exactly the ambivalence Sarah Spencer had apparently already sensed in him 4 years earlier. Diana, then 19 and still weeks away from her wedding, later said the comment threw her completely, though she said nothing about it publicly at the time. Another instance of a young woman absorbing a warning sign in real time and having no institutional space in which to act on it. That ambivalence became fully public in November of 1995, when Diana gave her own explosive interview to the BBC programme Panorama, conducted in secret without the palace's knowledge, and watched by an estimated 22 million people in Britain alone. In it, Diana spoke with a directness that, in its own way, echoed Sarah's 1977 interview far more closely than anything else in this story, describing her marriage's breakdown, her own struggles with bulimia and self-harm during the hardest years of it, and Camilla's continued presence in Charles's life in a single unforgettable line. "There were 3 of us in this marriage, so it was a bit crowded." The interview effectively ended any remaining public ambiguity about the state of the marriage, and led, within months, to the Queen personally requesting that Charles and Diana divorce, which they did the following year. It is a strange, sad symmetry that the 2 most consequential public statements in this entire story, Sarah's 1977 interview and Diana's 1995 one, were both made by Spencer women telling the truth about the same man on television and in print, 18 years apart, to 2 very different results. Sarah Spencer, in other words, was never actually competing against Anna Wallace, or against any of the other women whose names briefly attached themselves to Charles across this decade. She was competing, without ever fully realizing the scale of it at the time, against a relationship that had already survived 1 marriage on each side and would go on to survive a second, becoming eventually exactly the marriage Charles wanted all along, once duty and timing and family disapproval had finally stopped standing in the way of it. Knowing that, the interview Sarah gave in 1977 reads slightly differently than it does on its own. She was not simply a young woman being unusually honest about her feelings. She may well have been, whether she used this exact language or not, a young woman who had already sensed that whatever she and Charles had, it was never going to be the thing he actually wanted, because the thing he actually wanted had already been married off to somebody else 4 years earlier and had never really left. That is, in the end, the quietest and most durable irony sitting underneath every part of this story. Sarah Spencer spent a year and a half being measured against a standard she could never actually meet, not because of anything lacking in her, but because the position had effectively already been filled, years earlier, by a woman circumstance had removed from contention rather than any genuine decision on Charles's part to look elsewhere. She was not competing against Camilla's beauty, or her wit, or her family's standing. She was competing against a first love that had never fully ended, a contest nobody, however clear-sighted, however honest with a reporter, was ever actually in a position to win. Their brother's own romantic history offers a useful final point of comparison here, since it is, in its own way, the most conventional and least examined outcome among the four Spencer children, and precisely because of that, it says something about what happens to a family's sense of itself once the specific public pressure this account has spent so long describing finally lifts. Charles Spencer married twice, both times to women outside the narrow social pool his father's generation would have considered, without any of the institutional vetting or press circus that had once surrounded his sister's entanglements with royalty, and both marriages, whatever their private difficulties, unfolded largely as ordinary marriages do, in private, subject to ordinary strains rather than the specific manufactured strain of being assessed for suitability by a nation of newspaper readers. That he could marry, divorce, and remarry with something closer to normal privacy, a privilege neither of his sisters ever fully had access to during the years that mattered most to this account, says something plain. Most of what happened to Sarah and to Diana was a function of one specific man's attention rather than of the Spencer name itself. The same family, absent a prince in the picture, produced a set of adult relationships that looked, in the end, considerably more ordinary than anything the tabloids of the 1970s ever could have imagined for any of Johnny Spencer's children. It is worth remembering, closing out this comparison, that ordinary is not a small thing to have won back after a family spent 3 generations feeding daughters and sons into the machinery this account has spent so long describing. Sarah fought for it explicitly, in an interview she gave at 22. Her brother arrived at something like the same outcome simply by never being asked, by history, to make the same choice in public. Diana never got the chance to choose it at all. 3 siblings, 3 completely different relationships to the one resource that mattered most in every version of this story, the ability to live a life that belonged, in the end, to the person actually living it, rather than to the institution watching from just outside the frame. That resource, ordinary autonomy over one's own private life, is easy to take for granted from outside a story like this one, and easy to underestimate the cost of reclaiming, once it has already been placed on offer, to an institution as old and as demanding as the one at the center of this account. Sarah Spencer reclaimed it early, at real short-term cost to her public image, and at no cost at all, as it turned out, to her long-term happiness. That trade, weighed clearly, and made deliberately at 22, is the actual subject of this documentary, far more than any of the princes, palaces, or headlines that have carried the story this far. That is worth remembering the next time a documentary like this one opens with a prince, a palace, and a beautiful woman standing somewhere between them. The prince is rarely the point. The palace is rarely the point. The point, almost always, if you look closely enough and wait long enough for the cameras to move on, is the woman deciding, in whatever quiet moment history actually grants her, what she is and is not willing to give up in exchange for everything on offer. In the years since Diana's death, Sarah has remained, by design, one of the least visible members of an extremely visible family. She continued raising her own children in Lincolnshire, kept her involvement with charitable causes largely local and largely unpublicized, and settled into the role that had, in a sense, been available to her the whole time, and that she seems to have wanted from the very beginning. A private life conducted mostly outside the reach of the cameras that had once tried to install her at the center of the royal story. She did not write a memoir, she did not give the kind of tell-all interview that so many other figures adjacent to Diana's life eventually gave, to television networks and to newspapers, willing to pay handsomely for a fresh angle on a story the public had already consumed 100 different ways. Whatever she actually thought, in private, about the marriage her sister endured, or about the man she had once nearly married herself, she kept it there, in private, which by the standards of everyone else connected to this saga, makes her something close to an anomaly. She did not disappear from royal life entirely. As an aunt to William and Harry, she remained part of the extended family gatherings that continued long after Diana's death, present at the kind of milestones, weddings, christenings, and eventually the state occasions of the following decades, that a family member attends without needing to be the center of press attention. She was among the extended family present for the funeral of Queen Elizabeth II in September of 2022, and for the coronation of King Charles III the following year, a ceremony that placed the man she had once been expected to marry on the throne at last, watched, among many hundreds of other guests, by the sister-in-law he had never married, sitting in a congregation built largely out of exactly the kind of people this documentary has spent the last half-hour describing, families who had spent generations circling the same handful of positions near the crown, some of them successfully, most of them not. Althorp itself has changed considerably since the days when a young prince could arrive there for a private weekend's shooting, without the world watching. Charles Spencer opened the house to the public as a visitor attraction not long after inheriting it, and today it draws thousands of tourists each summer, many of them coming specifically to see the island memorial built on the estate's ornamental lake, where Diana is buried, and the exhibition housed in the former stable block that tells her life story through dresses, letters, and personal effects. The house that once quietly hosted a future king's courtship of one daughter, and then unknowingly hosted the introduction that would define the life of another, now operates as a business built substantially around commemorating the second of those two outcomes, the tragic one, while the first, Sarah's own quieter and considerably less commercially interesting story, gets at most a passing mention on a family tree displayed somewhere in the house, if it gets mentioned there at all. It is worth pausing on that image, because it captures something the rest of this story has been circling around from the beginning. Sarah Spencer sat in that congregation not as a footnote to Charles's life, but as a member of his family in her own right, the sister of the woman who did marry him, the aunt of the man who will eventually succeed him, and a witness, closer than almost anyone else alive, to the entire arc of how the modern monarchy got from the young, restless prince who once took her skiing at Klosters to the 60-something-year-old king, finally settling into a throne that had, by then, already cost the family 2 divorces, one death that shook the world, and a reputation for personal happiness that none of the institution's careful audition process ever seemed capable of protecting. The path that led from that ski slope in Klosters to that coronation congregation is also, if you follow it all the way through, the story of an institution slowly, reluctantly, and only ever under duress, learning to stop repeating its own mistake. Charles and Camilla finally married in 2005, 32 years after her wedding to Andrew Parker Bowles first pushed her out of contention as his bride, and by the time that marriage happened, the public reaction was less outrage than something closer to exhausted acceptance, an acknowledgement that the two of them had simply outlasted every objection the institution had ever raised against them. It is difficult to look at that outcome and not think back to Sarah Spencer's own 1977 observation, delivered to a reporter who had no idea how prophetic it would turn out to be, that whatever she and Charles had was never going to be the thing he actually wanted. That acceptance deepened further in the years that followed. When Charles and Camilla married in 2005, the marriage was legally a civil ceremony rather than a full state wedding, and the palace initially announced that Camilla would be known as Princess Consort rather than Queen once Charles took the throne. A careful piece of titling meant to soften an arrangement the institution still was not entirely comfortable presenting to the public at full volume. That caution eased further still by the time Queen Elizabeth marked her Platinum Jubilee in early 2022, when she issued a public statement expressing her sincere wish that Camilla be known as Queen Consort when the time came, a formal royal endorsement that effectively closed the last remaining question about how completely the institution had come around. When Charles was crowned in May of 2023, Camilla was crowned alongside him as Queen, not Princess Consort, the full and unambiguous title that would have been unthinkable to grant her at almost any earlier point across the 5 decades this account has covered, and certainly unthinkable in 1973, when her marriage to Andrew Parker Bowles was treated by the same institution as the end of any possibility that she might ever wear a crown at all. The institution did not learn its lesson quickly, though, and the marriage that came directly after Charles and Diana's, between Prince Andrew and Sarah Ferguson, followed a strikingly similar arc to the one this account has spent so long describing. Ferguson, like Diana, was young, largely untested by public life, and swept into an engagement after a whirlwind courtship in 1985, only to find herself just as unprepared for the scrutiny and just as isolated within the institution's rigid expectations as her sister-in-law had been. That marriage ended in separation in 1992 and divorce in 1996. The same year Charles and Diana's own divorce was finalized, two royal marriages collapsing within months of each other in what the Queen herself, in a speech later that year, memorably called her annus horribilis. Between Diana and Fergie, the pattern Mountbatten had once quietly encouraged, choosing young, untested women with no history of their own to complicate the marriage, had by the early 1990s produced two very public, very painful failures in a single generation, and even an institution as slow to change as the British monarchy could not entirely ignore what that suggested about the model itself. The next generation appears to have absorbed at least part of that lesson, whether by design or simply by the accumulated caution of watching two marriages collapse in the full glare of the world's press. Some of that caution became genuinely institutional rather than merely cultural. The modern royal household, by the time William reached adulthood, had developed considerably more formal mechanisms for managing a prospective bride's introduction to public life than anything available to Sarah or even to Diana. Coordinated communications planning around any relationship serious enough to attract press attention, informal guidance from the family's own press office on how to handle specific situations, and a general institutional recognition, learned at enormous cost, that leaving a young woman to face Fleet Street essentially alone, the way Sarah had been left in 1977, and Diana far more damagingly in 1980, was no longer an acceptable way to run a courtship. None of this made the experience easy for Kate Middleton, who endured years of intrusive coverage of her own before her wedding, including tabloid nicknames mocking her family's background and her own perceived patience in waiting for a proposal. But the institution itself had at least learned to treat the problem as its own responsibility to manage, rather than something a prospective bride was simply expected to absorb alone, a shift that owes a direct, if rarely acknowledged, debt to everything that went wrong for the women who came before her. The nicknames themselves form their own small, telling thread through this entire history, worth naming together in one place, since they otherwise scatter across 5 decades of separate coverage. Diana was Shy Di before her wedding, a label that flattened a genuinely complex young woman into a single marketable trait. Sarah Ferguson became Fergie almost immediately upon her engagement to Prince Andrew, and never fully escaped the diminutive even after the marriage ended in very public financial and personal scandal. Kate Middleton spent the better part of a decade as Weighty Katie, a nickname that mocked the very patience the modern, slower courtship model this account has just described actually required of her, punishing her for exactly the caution the institution had supposedly learned to value. Sarah Spencer herself never received a comparably sticky nickname of her own, an absence that, on reflection, tells its own small story, since the newspapers of 1977 and 78 were clearly building toward one, engaged in exactly the same process of flattening a real woman into a marketable type, before she ended the story herself, before the nickname had time to fully attach. William met Kate Middleton at university, at St Andrews in Scotland, and the two of them dated for the better part of a decade before marrying in 2011, a courtship conducted with a level of ordinary, unhurried familiarity that would have been almost unthinkable for Charles's generation, let alone Sarah Spencer's. Kate was 28 when she became engaged, not 19 and untested. She had lived independently, had watched her own relationship with William survive a well-publicized breakup and reconciliation, and had, by the time the marriage actually happened, spent roughly 10 years learning what the role required before she ever had to perform it in front of a global audience. Harry's marriage to Meghan Markle in 2018 represented a different kind of departure again, a match with an American, previously married, mixed-race actress that would have been almost unimaginable within the institution's unwritten rules as they existed in Sarah Spencer's day, and one whose eventual unraveling, the couple's departure from official royal duties in 2020 and their move to the United States, has been argued over so extensively and so publicly by nearly everyone involved that this account has no interest in relitigating it here, beyond noting the obvious point that it happened, and that it represents its own complicated referendum on how much the institution's old habits had actually changed by the time a new kind of candidate walked into them. Harry's own memoir, Spare, published in January of 2023, added an unusually candid layer to this entire history when it appeared, since it was the first time a senior royal had written at length and in his own voice about his parents' courtship and marriage from the inside, describing a household shaped by exactly the kind of formal distance and institutional pressure. This account has traced back through Charles's own childhood at Gordonston and through Mountbatten's original advice about choosing a suitable, untested bride. Harry wrote about growing up aware, from a young age, of Camilla's presence in his father's life and of the strain that presence placed on his mother, and he wrote with evident frustration about an institution he came to see as having consistently prioritized its own image over the well-being of the people inside it, Diana included. Whatever one makes of the book's more contested claims about specific family disputes, its basic account of an institution that keeps asking the people who marry into it to absorb costs the institution itself refuses to bear lines up closely enough with everything Sarah Spencer intuited 50 years earlier that it is difficult to read the two accounts side by side and conclude the underlying problem was ever really solved, only that each generation has found a slightly different way of describing it. Set against all of that, Sarah Spencer's brief, largely forgotten courtship with Charles in the late 1970s looks less like a footnote and more like an early, quiet data point in a pattern the institution would spend the next 5 decades failing to fully reckon with, one young woman after another discovering, at whatever age and under whatever circumstances she happened to discover it, exactly how much the role was going to cost her, and the family around Charles slowly, unevenly, and at enormous personal cost to nearly everyone involved, adjusting its own expectations only after each failure had already done its damage. It is worth asking, at this point, why a story with this much genuine substance in it, family scandal, institutional pressure, a young woman's rare public act of self-possession, a genuine and traceable line running from a Northamptonshire shooting weekend all the way to a coronation held decades later, gets told so rarely and so thinly compared to almost everything else connected to Diana's life. Part of the answer is simply commercial. Diana's own story, with its fairy tale wedding and its devastating ending, offers a shape that documentary makers and biographers know how to sell. Rising action, tragic climax, mourning, resolution. Sarah's story does not offer that shape. It offers a young woman who saw trouble coming and calmly avoided it, which is a genuinely unusual and instructive thing for a person to do, but it is also, by the ordinary rules of narrative drama, a story that ends before the interesting part is supposed to begin. There is no wedding to build toward. There is no divorce to mourn. There is only a woman who made one clear-eyed decision at 22, and then got to live the rest of her life largely off-camera, which turns out to be a very difficult thing to build 90 minutes of dramatic narration around, however much more admirable it might be than almost anything else this genre usually covers. The other part of the answer is that Sarah's story does not flatter the institution the way a more conventional telling of Charles's search for a bride would prefer to be flattered. A story about a woman who looked closely at Prince Charles, understood exactly what marrying him would cost her, and declined, is a considerably less comfortable story for the royal family's own preferred narrative than a story about a fairy tale that simply happened to end badly through nobody's particular fault. It suggests, gently but unmistakably, that the fault sat with a system that kept producing the same impossible bargain for every woman who came near it. A system Sarah Spencer was simply the first person in this particular chain of events clear-sighted enough to refuse. The handful of serious biographers who have written about Diana at length treat Sarah's courtship the same way, as a brief preliminary detail rather than a story worth its own sustained attention. Andrew Morton, whose 1992 book, Diana, Her True Story, was built on secret cooperation from Diana herself and reshaped public understanding of the marriage's true condition, mentions Sarah's relationship with Charles, mainly as scene setting for how the Spencer family first entered the royal family's orbit. Sally Bedell Smith's biographies of both Diana and Charles cover the courtship in a few paragraphs before moving on to the main event. Tina Brown's The Diana Chronicles, probably the single most widely read account of the Spencer family's entanglement with the House of Windsor, gives Sarah slightly more room than most, enough to note the dustman quote and the general shape of the courtship, but still treats her fundamentally as a supporting character in someone else's story, rather than as a subject worth investigating on her own terms. None of these writers got anything wrong, exactly. They simply made the same narrative choice every version of this story tends to make, following the more famous, more tragic sister, and treating the one who walked away cleanly as a footnote, which is precisely the gap this account has tried to fill. There is a temptation, telling a story like this one, to make Sarah Spencer either a tragic figure who lost her chance at history, or a quietly triumphant one who dodged a bullet her sister could not see coming. Neither version is entirely honest. She was, by the best available evidence, a young woman who spent roughly a year and a half finding out what life with Charles would actually require of her, decided the price was more than she was willing to pay, said so plainly when asked, and then went and built the kind of life she said she wanted in the first place. That she happened to be standing nearby, 3 years later, when her teenage sister was introduced to the same man, has turned her into a minor character in someone else's tragedy, a role the actual historical record does not support nearly as well as the tabloids of the era, and the documentaries made since, would like it to. What actually happened to Sarah Spencer is, in the end, a quieter and more useful story than the one the headlines of 1977 were trying to write. The story of a woman who was offered, in as close to real time as the institution allowed, an honest preview of what marrying into that family would cost, and who had the clarity, at 22, to believe what she was seeing, rather than talk herself into wanting it anyway. She watched Charles closely enough, for long enough, to understand that his attention, however genuine it might have felt in the moment, was never going to be uncomplicated, and rather than wait to find that out the hard way, inside a marriage, in front of the entire world, she found it out early, said it out loud, and left. Her sister did not get that preview. By the time Diana had any real sense of what she was walking into, she was already engaged, already the subject of a level of press attention that made Sarah's own experience look mild, and already, by her own later account, deeply unhappy in a marriage that had been arranged around expectations nobody had bothered to check against reality. Whether Sarah could have told her more, warned her harder, or intervened somehow in the courtship that began at Balmoral in the summer of 1980, is one of those questions the historical record simply cannot answer, and one this account has no interest in pretending to settle. What can be said, plainly, is that Sarah Spencer saw the real Prince Charles first, years before her sister ever did, saw him clearly enough to walk away from him on her own terms, and spent the following 5 decades living the quiet, largely private life she said, back when nobody believed her, was the only kind of life she actually wanted. That is, if anything, the one part of this entire saga that ended more or less exactly the way the person at the center of it hoped it would, which, once you have spent this long looking at everyone else this story touched, might be the most unusual outcome in it. Go back for a moment to that muddy field at Althorp, because it is worth looking at one more time, now that you know everything that came before and after it. A prince in borrowed Wellingtons, a shooting lunch, a 22-year-old daughter of the house, managing the logistics of the weekend, the way she had managed every other detail of a courtship the entire country was watching, and a 16-year-old, half interested, wandering past on her way to somewhere else, about to be handed, without either of them knowing it, the exact set of circumstances her older sister had already looked at clearly enough to refuse. If this were a work of fiction, that scene would be staged as foreboding, ominous music under a lingering shot of the two sisters, some visual cue telling the audience to feel the weight of what was coming. It carried no such weight at the time. It was simply a cold Saturday in the country, forgotten by nearly everyone who was there almost as soon as it ended, which is exactly how most of the moments that end up mattering most actually happen, without music, without warning, noticed by no one until decades of hindsight turn an ordinary afternoon into the hinge on which an entire family's history quietly turned. What this account has tried to do, across all of the family history, the press culture, the institutional patterns stretching back through Margaret and Wallace Simpson and Georgiana Spencer, and even further, is put Sarah's decision back into the context that makes it make sense, because stripped of that context, a young woman turning down a prince sounds almost too simple to be interesting. The reality took real work. It required Sarah Spencer to see past the enormous, genuinely overwhelming weight of everything she was being offered. The title, the wealth, the permanent place in history, and weigh it honestly against what she could already tell it would cost her, at an age when very few people have the self-knowledge to make that kind of calculation about anything, let alone about the single most consequential decision most women of her background and generation would ever be asked to make. That she got it right, and that her own sister, 4 years later and with none of the same clarity available to her, got the same underlying bet, catastrophically wrong, says nothing about either woman's character, and everything about a system that kept running the same experiment, on woman after woman, and kept being surprised by the results it should have been able to predict, from Sarah Spencer's own answer years earlier, if anyone in a position of real power had bothered to actually listen to it. There is one last thing worth saying, and it has nothing to do with princes or palaces. Sarah Spencer is, as of this recording, still alive, still largely private, still declining, by every indication available, to turn the one truly dramatic near miss of her early life into the kind of paid confession so many other people connected to this story eventually agreed to give. That refusal has held for nearly 50 years now, through her sister's wedding, through her sister's divorce, through her sister's death, and the decades of documentaries, books, and dramatizations that followed it, including, in its own small way, this one. It would have been easy, at almost any point across those 5 decades, for Sarah to sell her version of events, to sit for the kind of interview that made fortunes for lesser figures on the edges of this same story, to finally explain, on her own terms and for a considerable fee, exactly what she saw in Prince Charles up close, before Diana ever did. She never has. Whatever that says about her, discretion as a genuine value rather than a performance, a simple lack of interest in being famous for something that happened to her at 22, or something else entirely, that this account has no way of knowing, it is, in the end, entirely consistent with the woman who told a reporter the truth, in 1977, and then spent the rest of her life quietly proving she meant it. Every other figure in this story eventually had their version of events written by someone else, in a biography, a documentary, a television interview, an authorized account, or an unauthorized one, the raw material of their lives processed and sold back to the public in one form or another, this account included. Sarah Spencer is the one person in it who has never once allowed that to happen on her own terms, who has been written about extensively, without ever once writing or speaking her own account into the record herself. That absence is, on reflection, the clearest remaining piece of evidence for exactly the argument this entire account has tried to make, rather than a gap in the historical record to be regretted, that a life conducted quietly, on one's own terms, away from the machinery that consumed nearly everyone else this story touched, was worth more to the person living it than anything the machinery could have offered in exchange for her cooperation. If this is the kind of royal history you want more of, the family trees nobody else bothers to untangle, the courtships that got erased once a more famous one came along, subscribing helps this channel keep making them, and there is a comment section below if you want to make the case for whoever you think deserves the next full-length documentary. Thank you for watching this one all the way through.